Men Like Gods, a novel by H.G. Wells, to Florence Lamont, in whose home at Inglewood this story was christened. Book the First, The Eruption of the Earthlings. Men Like Gods. Chapter the First. Mr. Barnstaple Takes a Holiday. Mr. Barnstaple found himself in urgent need of a holiday, and he had no one to go with and nowhere to go. He was overworked, and he was tired of home. He was a man of strong natural affections. He loved his family extremely, so that he knew it by heart, and when he was in these jaded moods, it bored him acutely. His 3 sons, who were all growing up, seemed to get leggier and larger every day. They sat down in the chairs he was just going to sit down in. They played him off his own pianola. They filled the house with hoarse, vast laughter at jokes that one couldn't demand to be told. They cut in on the elderly harmless flirtations that had hitherto been one of his chief consolations in this vale. They beat him at tennis. They fought playfully on the landings, and fell downstairs by 2s and 3s with an enormous racket. Their hats were everywhere. They were late for breakfast. They went to bed every night in a storm of uproar. Ha! Bump! And their mothers seemed to like it. They all cost money, with a cheerful disregard of the fact that everything had gone up except Mr. Barnstaple's earning power. And when he said a few plain truths about Mr. Lloyd George at mealtimes, or made the slightest attempt to raise the tone of the table talk above the level of the silliest persiflage, their attention wandered ostentatiously. At any rate, it seemed ostentatiously. He wanted badly to get away from his family to some place where he could think of its various members with quiet pride and affection, and otherwise not be disturbed by them. And also he wanted to get away for a time from Mr. Peeve. The very streets were becoming a torment to him. He wanted never to see a newspaper or a newspaper placard again. He was obsessed by apprehensions of some sort of financial and economic smash that would make the Great War seem a mere incidental catastrophe. This was because he was sub-editor and general factotum of the Liberal, that well-known organ of the more depressing aspects of advanced thought, and the unvarying pessimism of Mr. Peeve, his chief, was infecting him more and more. Formerly it had been possible to put up a sort of resistance to Mr. Peeve by joking furtively about his gloom with the other members of the staff, but now there were no other members of the staff. They had all been retrenched by Mr. Peeve in a mood of financial despondency. Practically now, nobody wrote regularly for the Liberal except Mr. Barnstaple and Mr. Peeve. So Mr. Peeve had it all his own way with Mr. Barnstaple. He would sit hunched up in the editorial chair with his hands deep in his trouser pockets, taking a gloomy view of everything, sometimes for 2 hours together. Mr. Barnstaple's natural tendency was towards a modest hopefulness and a belief in progress, but Mr. Peeve held very strongly that a belief in progress was at least 6 years out of date, and that the brightest hope that remained to liberalism was for a good day of judgment soon. And having finished the copy of what the staff, when there was a staff, used to call his weekly indigest, Mr. Peeve would depart and leave Mr. Barnstaple to get the rest of the paper together for the next week. Even in ordinary times, Mr. Peeve would have been hard enough to live with. But the times were not ordinary. They were full of disagreeable occurrences that made his melancholy anticipations all too plausible. The great coal lockout had been going on for a month and seemed to foreshadow the commercial ruin of England. Every morning brought intelligence of fresh outrages from Ireland, unforgivable and unforgettable outrages. A prolonged drought threatened the harvests of the world. The League of Nations, of which Mr. Barnstaple had hoped enormous things in the great days of President Wilson, was a melancholy and self-satisfied futility. Everywhere there was conflict, everywhere unreason. 7/8 of the world seemed to be sinking down towards chronic disorder and social dissolution. Even without Mr. Peeve, it would have been difficult enough to have made headway against the facts. Mr. Barnstaple was, indeed, ceasing to secrete hope, and for such types as he, hope is the essential solvent without which there is no digesting life. His hope had always been in liberalism and generous liberal effort, but he was beginning to think that liberalism would never do anything more forever than sit hunched up with its hands in its pockets, grumbling and peeving at the activities of baser but more energetic men, whose scrambling activities would inevitably wreck the world. Night and day now, Mr. Barnstaple was worrying about the world at large. By night even more than by day, for sleep was leaving him, and he was haunted by a dreadful craving to bring out a number of the Liberal of his very own, to alter it all after Mr. Peeve had gone away. to cut out all the dyspeptic stuff, the miserable, empty girding at this wrong and that, the gloating on cruel and unhappy things, the exaggeration of the simple, natural, human misdeeds of Mr. Lloyd George, the appeals to Lord Grey, Lord Robert Cecil, Lord Lansdowne, the Pope, Queen Anne, or the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. It varied from week to week. To arise and give voice and form to the young aspirations of a world reborn, and, instead, to fill the number with utopia. To say to the amazed readers of the Liberal, "Here are the things that have to be done. Here are the things we are going to do." What a blow it would be for Mr. Peeve at his Sunday breakfast! For once, too astonished to secrete abnormally, he might even digest that meal. But this was the most foolish of dreaming. There were the 3 young Barnstaples at home and their need for a decent start in life to consider. And, beautiful as the thing was as a dream, Mr. Barnstaple had a very unpleasant conviction that he was not really clever enough to pull such a thing off. He would make a mess of it somehow. One might jump from the frying pan into the fire. The Liberal was a dreary, discouraging, ungenerous paper, but anyhow it was not a base and wicked paper. Still, if there was to be no such disastrous outbreak, it was imperative that Mr. Barnstaple should rest from Mr. Peeve for a time. Once or twice already he had contradicted him. A row might occur any time. And the first step towards resting from Mr. Peeve was evidently to see a doctor. So Mr. Barnstaple went to a doctor. "My nerves are getting out of control," said Mr. Barnstaple. "I feel horribly neurasthenic." "You are suffering from neurasthenia," said the doctor. "I dread my daily work." "You want a holiday?" "You think I need a change?" "As complete a change as you can manage." "Can you recommend any place where I could go?" "Where do you want to go?" "Nowhere definite. I thought you could recommend—" "Let some place attract you and go there. Do nothing to force your inclinations at the present time." Mr. Barnstaple paid the doctor the sum of 1 guinea, and, armed with these instructions, prepared to break the news of his illness and his necessary absence to Mr. Peeve whenever the occasion seemed ripe for doing so. For a time, this prospective holiday was merely a fresh addition to Mr. Barnstaple's already excessive burthen of worries. To decide to get away was to find oneself face to face at once with 3 apparently insurmountable problems. How to get away? Whither? And since Mr. Barnstaple was one of those people who tire very quickly of their own company, with whom? A sharp gleam of furtive scheming crept into the candid misery that had recently become Mr. Barnstaple's habitual expression. But then, no one took much notice of Mr. Barnstaple's expressions. One thing was very clear in his mind. Not a word of this holiday must be breathed at home. If once Mrs. Barnstaple got wind of it, he knew exactly what would happen. She would, with an air of competent devotion, take charge of the entire business. "You must have a good holiday," she would say. She would select some rather distant and expensive resort in Cornwall or Scotland or Brittany. She would buy a lot of outfit. She would have afterthoughts to swell the luggage with inconvenient parcels at the last moment. And she would bring the boys. Probably she would arrange for 1 or 2 groups of acquaintances to come to the same place to liven things up. If they did, they were certain to bring the worst sides of their natures with them and to develop into the most indefatigable of bores. There would be no conversation. There would be much unreal laughter. There would be endless games. No! But how was a man to go away for a holiday without his wife getting wind of it? Somehow a bag must be packed and smuggled out of the house. The most hopeful thing about Mr. Barnstaple's position, from Mr. Barnstable's point of view, was that he owned a small automobile of his very own. It was natural that this car should play a large part in his secret plannings. It seemed to offer the easiest means of getting away. It converted the possible answer to whither from a fixed, indefinite place into what mathematicians call, I believe, a locus. And there was something so companionable about the little beast that it did to a slight but quite perceptible extent answer the question, with whom? It was a 2-seater. It was known in the family as the Footbath, Coleman's Mustard, and the Yellow Peril. As these names suggest, it was a low, open car of clear yellow color. Mr. Barnstaple used it to come up to the office from Sydenham because it did 33 miles to the gallon and was ever so much cheaper than a season ticket. It stood up in the court under the office window during the day. At Sydenham it lived in a shed of which Mr. Barnstaple carried the only key. So far, he had managed to prevent the boys from either driving it or taking it to pieces. At times, Mrs. Barnstaple made him drive her about Sydenham for her shopping, but she did not really like the little car because it exposed her to the elements too much and made her dusty and disheveled. Both by reason of all that it made possible and by reason of all that it debarred, the little car was clearly indicated as the medium for the needed holiday. And Mr. Barnstaple really liked driving it. He drove very badly, but he drove very carefully, and though it sometimes stopped and refused to proceed, it did not do, or at any rate it had not so far done, as most other things did in Mr. Barnstaple's life, which was to go due east when he turned the steering wheel west, so that it gave him an agreeable sense of mastery. In the end, Mr. Barnstaple made his decisions with great rapidity. Opportunity suddenly opened in front of him. Thursday was his day at the printer's, and he came home on Thursday evening feeling horribly jaded. The weather kept obstinately hot and dry. It made it none the less distressing that this drought presaged famine and misery for half the world. And London was in full season, smart and grinning. If anything, it was a sillier year than 1913, the great tango year, which, in the light of subsequent events, Mr. Barnstaple had hitherto regarded as the silliest year in the world's history. The Star had the usual batch of bad news along the margin of the sporting and fashionable intelligence that got the displayed space. Fighting was going on between the Russians and Poles, and also in Ireland, Asia Minor, the India frontier, and eastern Siberia. There had been 3 new horrible murders. The miners were still out, and a big engineering strike was threatened. There had been only standing room in the down train, and it had started 20 minutes late. He found a note from his wife explaining that her cousins at Wimbledon had telegraphed that there was an unexpected chance of seeing the tennis there with Mademoiselle Langland and all the rest of the champions, and that she had gone over with the boys and would not be back until late. It would do their game no end of good, she said, to see some really first-class tennis, and it was the servants' social that night. Would he mind being left alone in the house for once? The servants would put him out some cold supper before they went. Mr. Barnstaple read this note with resignation. While he ate his supper, he ran his eye over a pamphlet a Chinese friend had sent him to show how the Japanese were deliberately breaking up what was left of the civilization and education of China. It was only as he was sitting and smoking a pipe in his little back garden after supper that he realized all that being left alone in the house meant for him. Then suddenly he became very active. He rang up Mr. Peeve, told him of the doctor's verdict, explained that the affairs of the Liberal were just then in a particularly leavable state, and got his holiday. Then he went to his bedroom and packed up a hasty selection of things to take with him in an old Gladstone bag that was not likely to be immediately missed, and put this in the dicky of his car, after which he spent some time upon a letter which he addressed to his wife and put away very carefully in his breast pocket. Then he locked up the car shed and composed himself in a deck chair in the garden with his pipe and a nice thoughtful book on the bankruptcy of Europe, so as to look and feel as innocent as possible before his family came home. When his wife returned, he told her casually that he believed he was suffering from neurasthenia, and that he had arranged to run up to London on the morrow and consult a doctor in the matter. Mrs. Barnstaple wanted to choose him a doctor, but he got out of that by saying that he had to consider Peeve in the matter, and that Peeve was very strongly set on the man he had already in fact consulted. And when Mrs. Barnstaple said that she believed they all wanted a good holiday, he just grunted in a non-committal manner. In this way, Mr. Barnstaple was able to get right away from his house with all the necessary luggage for some week's holiday without arousing any insurmountable opposition. He started next morning Londonward. The traffic on the way was gay and plentiful, but by no means troublesome, and the Yellow Peril was running so sweetly that she might almost have been named the Golden Hope. In Camberwell, he turned into the Camberwell New Road and made his way to the post office at the top of Vauxhall Bridge Road. There he drew up. He was scared but elated by what he was doing. He went into the post office and sent his wife a telegram. Dr. Pagan, he wrote, says solitude and rest urgently needed, so am going off Lake District, recuperate, have got bag and things, expecting this letter follows. Then he came outside and fumbled in his pocket and produced and posted the letter he had written so carefully overnight. It was deliberately scrawled to suggest neurasthenia at an acute phase. Dr. Pagan, it explained, had ordered an immediate holiday and suggested that Mr. Barnstaple should wander north. It would be better to cut off all letters for a few days or even a week or so. He would not trouble to write unless something went wrong. No news would be good news. Rest assured, all would be well. As soon as he had a certain address for letters, he would wire it, but only very urgent things were to be sent on. After this, he resumed his seat in his car with such a sense of freedom as he had never felt since his first holidays from his first school. He made for the Great North Road, but at the traffic jam at Hyde Park Corner he allowed the policeman to turn him down towards Knightsbridge, and afterwards at the corner where the Bath Road forks away from the Oxford Road an obstructive van put him into the former, but it did not matter very much. Any way led to elsewhere, and he could work northward later. The day was one of those days of gay sunshine that were characteristic of the great drought of 1921. It was not in the least sultry. Indeed, there was a freshness about it that blended with Mr. Barnstable's mood to convince him that there were quite agreeable adventures before him. Hope had already returned to him. He knew he was on the way out of things, though as yet he had not the slightest suspicion how completely out of things the way was going to take him. It would be quite a little adventure presently to stop at an inn and get some lunch, and if he felt lonely as he went on he would give somebody a lift and talk. It would be quite easy to give people lifts because so long as his back was generally towards Sydenham and the Liberal office, it did not matter at all now in which direction he went. A little way out of Slough he was passed by an enormous grey touring car. It made him start and swerve. It came up alongside him without a sound, and though according to his only very slightly inaccurate speedometer he was doing a good 27 miles an hour, it had passed him in a moment. Its occupants, he noted, were 3 gentlemen and a lady. They were all sitting up and looking backward as though they were interested in something that was following them. They went by too quickly for him to note more than that the lady was radiantly lovely in an immediate and indisputable way, and the gentleman nearest to him had a peculiarly elfin yet elderly face. Before he could recover from the eclat of this passage, a car with the voice of a prehistoric saurian warned him that he was again being overtaken. This was how Mr. Barnstable liked being passed, by negotiation. He slowed down, abandoned any claim to the crown of the road, and made encouraging gestures with his hand. A large, smooth, swift limousine availed itself of his permission to use the 30-odd feet or so of road to the right of him. It was carrying a fair load of luggage, but except for a young gentleman with an eyeglass who was sitting beside the driver, he saw nothing of its passengers. It swept round a corner ahead in the wake of the touring car. Now even a mechanical footbath does not like being passed in this lordly fashion on a bright morning on the open road. Mr. Barnstable's accelerator went down, and he came round that corner a good 10 miles per hour faster than his usual cautious practice. He found the road quite clear ahead of him. Indeed, he found the road much too clear ahead of him. It stretched straight in front of him for perhaps 1/3 of a mile. On the left were a low, well-trimmed hedge, scattered trees, level fields, some small cottages lying back, remote poplars, and a distant view of Windsor Castle. On the right were level fields, a small inn, and a background of low wooded hills. A conspicuous feature in this tranquil landscape was the board advertisement of a riverside motel at Maidenhead. Before him was a sort of heat flicker in the air, and 2 or 3 little dust whirls spinning along the road, and there was not a sign of the grey touring car, and not a sign of the limousine. It took Mr. Barnstable the better part of 2 seconds to realize the full astonishment of this fact. Neither to the right nor left was there any possible side road down which either car could have vanished, and if they had already got round the further bend, then they must be travelling at the rate of 200 or 300 miles per hour. It was Mr. Barnstable's excellent custom, whenever he was in doubt, to slow down. He slowed down now. He went on at a pace of perhaps 15 miles an hour, staring open-mouthed about the empty landscape for some clue to this mysterious disappearance. Curiously enough, he had no feeling that he himself was in any sort of danger. Then his car seemed to strike something and skidded. It skidded round so violently that for a moment or so Mr. Barnstable lost his head. He could not remember what ought to be done when a car skids. He recalled something vaguely about steering in the direction in which the car is skidding, but he could not make out in the excitement of the moment in what direction the car was skidding. Afterwards he remembered that at this point he heard a sound. It was exactly the same sound, coming as the climax of an accumulating pressure, sharp like the snapping of a lute string, which one hears at the end, or beginning, of insensibility under anesthetics. He had seemed to twist round towards the hedge on the right, but now he found the road ahead of him again. He touched his accelerator and then slowed down and stopped. He stopped in the profoundest astonishment. This was an entirely different road from the one he had been upon half a minute before. The hedges had changed, the trees had altered, Windsor Castle had vanished, and, a small compensation, the big limousine was in sight again. It was standing by the roadside about 200 yards away. Men like gods. Chapter the second. The Wonderful Road. For a time, Mr. Barnstable's attention was very unequally divided between the limousine, whose passengers were now descending, and the scenery about him. This latter was indeed so strange and beautiful that it was only as people who must be sharing his admiration and amazement, and who therefore might conceivably help to elucidate and relieve his growing and quite overwhelming perplexity, that the little group ahead presently arose to any importance in his consciousness. The road itself, instead of being packed together pebbles and dirt smeared with tar with a surface of grit, dust, and animal excrement of a normal English highroad, was apparently made of glass, clear in places as still water, and in places milky or opalescent, shot with streaks of soft color or glittering richly with clouds of embedded golden flakes. It was perhaps 12 or 15 yards wide. On either side was a band of greensward of a finer grass than Mr. Barnstable had ever seen before, and he was an expert and observant mower of lawns. And beyond this, a wide border of flowers, where Mr. Barnstable sat agape in his car, and perhaps for 30 yards in either direction, this border was a mass of some unfamiliar blossom of forget-me-not blue. Then the color was broken by an increasing number of tall, pure white spikes that finally ousted the blue altogether from the bed. On the opposite side of the way, these same spikes were mingled with masses of plants bearing seed pods equally strange to Mr. Barnstable, which varied through a series of blues and mauves and purples to an intense crimson. Beyond this glorious colored foam of flowers spread flat meadows on which creamy cattle were grazing. Three close at hand, a little startled perhaps by Mr. Barnstable's sudden apparition, chewed the cud and regarded him with benevolently speculative eyes. They had long horns and dewlaps like the cattle of South Europe and India. From these benign creatures, Mr. Barnstable's eyes went to a long line of flame-shaped trees, to a colonnade of white and gold, and to a background of snow-clad mountains. A few tall white clouds were sailing across a sky of dazzling blue. The air impressed Mr. Barnstable as being astonishingly clear and sweet. Except for the cows and a little group of people standing by the limousine, Mr. Barnstable could see no other living creature. The motorists were standing still and staring about them. A sound of querulous voices came to him. A sharp crepitation at his back turned Mr. Barnstable's attention round. By the side of the road, in the direction from which conceivably he had come, were the ruins of what appeared to be a very recently demolished stone house. Beside it were two large apple trees, freshly twisted and riven, as if by some explosion, and out of the center of it came a column of smoke, and this sound of things catching fire. And the contorted lines of these shattered apple trees helped Mr. Barnstable to realize that some of the flowers by the wayside near at hand were also bent down to one side, as if by the passage of a recent violent gust of wind. Yet he had heard no explosion, nor felt any wind. He stared for a time and then turned as if for an explanation to the limousine. Three of these people were now coming along the road towards him, led by a tall, slender, gray-headed gentleman in a felt hat and a long motoring dust coat. He had a small upturned face with a little nose that scarce sufficed for the springs of his gilt glasses. Mr. Barnstable restarted his engine and drove slowly to meet them. As soon as he judged himself within hearing distance, he stopped and put his head over the side of the yellow peril with a question. At the same moment, the tall, gray-headed gentleman asked practically the same question. "Can you tell me at all, sir, where we are?" 5 minutes ago," said Mr. Barnstable, "I should have said we were at the Maidenhead Road, near Slough." "Exactly," said the tall gentleman in earnest, argumentative tones. "Exactly, and I maintain that there is not the slightest reason for supposing that we are not still on the Maidenhead Road." The challenge of the dialectician rang in his voice. "It doesn't look like the Maidenhead Road," said Mr. Barnstable. "Agreed. But are we to judge by appearances, or are we to judge by the direct continuity of our experience? The Maidenhead Road led to this, was in continuity with this, and therefore I hold that this is the Maidenhead Road." "Those mountains?" considered Mr. Barnstable. "Windsor Castle ought to be there," said the tall gentleman brightly, as if he gave a point in a gambit. "Was there 5 minutes ago," said Mr. Barnstable. "Then obviously those mountains are some sort of a camouflage," said the tall gentleman triumphantly. "And the whole of this business is, as they say nowadays, a put-up thing." "It seems to be remarkably well put up," said Mr. Barnstaple. Came a pause during which Mr. Barnstaple surveyed the tall gentleman's companions. The tall gentleman he knew perfectly well. He had seen him a score of times at public meetings and public dinners. He was Mr. Cecil Burleigh, the great conservative leader. He was not only distinguished as a politician, he was eminent as a private gentleman, a philosopher, and a man of universal intelligence. Behind him stood a short, thick-set, middle-aged young man, unknown to Mr. Barnstaple, the natural hostility of whose appearance was greatly enhanced by an eyeglass. The third member of the little group was also a familiar form, but for a time Mr. Barnstaple could not place him. He had a clean-shaven, round, plump face and a well-nourished person, and his costume suggested either a high church clergyman or a prosperous Roman Catholic priest. The young man with the eyeglass now spoke in a kind of impotent falsetto. "I came down to Taplow Court by road not a month ago, and there was certainly nothing of this sort on the way then." "I admit there are difficulties," said Mr. Burleigh with gusto. "I admit there are considerable difficulties. Still, I venture to think my main proposition holds." "You don't think this is the Maidenhead Road?" said the gentleman with the eyeglass flatly to Mr. Barnstaple. "It seems too perfect for a put-up thing," said Mr. Barnstaple with a mild obstinacy. "But, my dear sir," protested Mr. Burleigh, "this road is notorious for nursery seedsmen, and sometimes they arrange the most astonishing displays, as an advertisement." "Then why don't we go straight on to Taplow Court now?" asked the gentleman with the eyeglass. "Because," said Mr. Burleigh, with a touch of asperity natural when one has to insist on a fact already clearly known and obstinately overlooked, "Rupert insists that we are in some other world, and won't go on. That is why. He has always had too much imagination. He thinks that things that don't exist can exist. And now he imagines himself in some sort of scientific romance and out of our world altogether, in another dimension. I sometimes think it would have been better for all of us if Rupert had taken to writing romances instead of living them. If you, as his secretary, think that you will be able to get him on to Taplow in time for lunch with the Windsor people—" Mr. Burleigh indicated by a gesture ideas for which he found words inadequate. Mr. Barnstaple had already noted a slow-moving, intent, sandy-complexioned figure in a gray top-hat with a black band that the caricaturists had made familiar, exploring the flowery tangle beside the limousine. This, then, must be no less well-known a person than Rupert Catskill, the Secretary of State for War. For once, Mr. Barnstaple found himself in entire agreement with this all-too-adventurous politician. This was another world. Mr. Barnstaple got out of his car and addressed himself to Mr. Burleigh. "I think we may get a lot of light upon just where we are, sir, if we explore this building which is burning here close at hand. I thought just now that I saw a figure lying on the slope close behind it. If we could catch one of the hoaxers—" He left his sentence unfinished because he did not believe for a moment that they were being hoaxed. Mr. Burleigh had fallen very much in his opinion in the last 5 minutes. All four men turned their faces to the smoking ruin. "It's a very extraordinary thing that there isn't a soul in sight," remarked the eyeglass gentleman, searching the horizon. "Well, I see no harm whatever in finding out what is burning," said Mr. Burleigh, and led the way, holding up an intelligent, anticipatory face towards the wrecked house between the broken trees. But before he had gone a dozen paces, the attention of the little group was recalled to the limousine by a loud scream of terror from the lady who had remained seated therein. "Really, this is too much!" cried Mr. Burleigh, with a note of genuine exasperation. "There must surely be police regulations to prevent this kind of thing." "It's out of some traveling menagerie," said the gentleman with the eyeglass. "What ought we to do?" "It looks tame," said Mr. Barnstaple, but without any impulse to put his theory to the test. "It might easily frighten people very seriously," said Mr. Burleigh, and lifting up a bland voice he shouted, "Don't be alarmed, Stella. It's probably quite tame and harmless. Don't irritate it with that sunshade. It might fly at you. Stella!" It was a big and beautifully marked leopard, which had come very softly out of the flowers and sat down like a great cat in the middle of the glass road at the side of the big car. It was blinking and moving its head from side to side rhythmically, with an expression of puzzled interest, as the lady, in accordance with the best traditions of such cases, opened and shut her parasol at it as rapidly as she could. The chauffeur had taken cover behind the car, Mr. Rupert Catskill stood staring, knee-deep in flowers, apparently only made aware of the creature's existence by the same scream that had attracted the attention of Mr. Burley and his companions. Mr. Catskill was the first to act, and his act showed his mettle. It was at once discreet and bold. "Stop flopping that sunshade, Lady Stella," he said. I will catch its eye." He made a detour around the car so as to come face to face with the animal. Then for a moment he stood, as it were displaying himself, a resolute little figure in a gray frock coat and a black banded top hat. He held out a cautious hand, not too suddenly for fear of startling the creature. "Pussy?" he said. The leopard, relieved by the cessation of Lady Stella's sunshade, regarded him with interest and curiosity. He drew closer. The leopard extended its muzzle and sniffed. "If it will only let me stroke it," said Mr. Catskill, and came within arm's length. The beast sniffed the extended hand with an expression of incredulity. Then, with a suddenness that sent Mr. Catskill back several paces, it sneezed. It sneezed again, much more violently, regarded Mr. Catskill reproachfully for a moment, and then leapt lightly over the flower bed and made off in the direction of the white and golden colonnade. The grazing cattle in the field, Mr. Barnstaple noted, watched its passage without the slightest sign of dismay. Mr. Catskill remained in a slightly expanded state in the middle of the road. "No animal," he remarked, "can stand up to the steadfast gaze of the human eye. Not one. It is a riddle for your materialist. Shall we join Mr. Cecil, Lady Stella? He seemed to have found something to look at down there. The man in the yellow car may know where he is, He assisted the lady to get out of the car, and the two came on after Mr. Barnstaple's party, which was now again approaching the burning house. The chauffeur, evidently not wishing to be left alone with the limousine in this world of incredible possibilities, followed as closely as respect permitted. Men like gods. Chapter the 3rd. The beautiful people. The fire in the little house did not seem to be making headway. The smoke that came from it was much less now than when Mr. Barnstaple had first observed it. As they came close, they found a quantity of twisted bits of bright metal and fragments of broken glass among the shattered masonry. The suggestion of exploded scientific apparatus was very strong. Then, almost simultaneously, the entire party became aware of a body lying on the grassy slope behind the ruins. It was the body of a man in the prime of life, naked except for a couple of bracelets and a necklace and girdle, and blood was oozing from his mouth and nostrils. With a kind of awe, Mr. Barnstaple knelt down beside this prostrate figure and felt its still heart. He had never seen so beautiful a face and body before. "Dead," he whispered. "Look!" cried the shrill voice of the man with the eyeglass. "Another!" He was pointing to something that was hidden from Mr. Barnstaple by a piece of wall. Mr. Barnstaple had to get up and climb over a heap of rubble before he could see this second find. It was a slender girl, clothed as little as the man. She had evidently been flung with enormous violence against the wall and killed instantaneously. Her face was quite undistorted, although her skull had been crushed in from behind. Her perfect mouth and green-gray eyes were a little open, and her expression was that of one who is still thinking out some difficult but interesting problem. She did not seem in the least bit dead, but merely disregardful. One hand still grasped a copper implement with a handle of glass. The other lay limp and prone. For some seconds nobody spoke. It was as if they all feared to interrupt the current of her thoughts. Then Mr. Barnstaple heard the voice of the priestly gentleman speaking very softly behind him. "What a perfect form," he said. "I admit I was wrong," said Mr. Burley with deliberation. "I have been wrong. These are no earthly people, manifestly, and ergo we are not on earth. I cannot imagine what has happened, nor where we are. In the face of sufficient evidence, I have never hesitated to retract an opinion. This world we are in is not our world. It is something—" He paused. "It is something very wonderful indeed." "And the Windsor party," said Mr. Catskill without any apparent regret, "must have its lunch without us." "But then," said the clerical gentleman, "what world are we in, and how did we get here?" "Ah, there," said Mr. Burley blandly, "you go altogether beyond my poor powers of guessing. We are here in some world that is singularly like our world and singularly unlike it. It must be in some way related to our world, or we could not be here. But how it can be related is, I confess, a hopeless mystery to me. Maybe we are in some other dimension of space than those we wot of.
but my poor head whirls at the thought of these dimensions. I am amazed. Einstein, injected the gentleman with the eyeglass, compactly and with evident self-satisfaction. Exactly, said Mr. Burley. Einstein might make it clear to us, or dear old Haldane might undertake to explain it and fog us up with that adipose Hegelianism of his. But I am neither Haldane nor Einstein. Here we are in some world which is, for all practical purposes, including the purpose of our week-end engagements, nowhere. Or if you prefer the Greek of it, we are in utopia. And as I do not see that there is any manifest way out of it again, I suppose the thing we have to do as rational creatures is to make the best of it, and watch our opportunities. It is certainly a very lovely world. The loveliness is even greater than the wonder. And there are human beings here, with minds. I judge from all this material lying about, it is a world in which experimental chemistry is pursued indeed to the bitter end, under almost idyllic conditions. Chemistry and nakedness. I feel bound to confess that whether we are to regard these two people who have apparently just blown themselves up here as Greek gods or as naked savages seems to me to be altogether a question of individual taste. I admit a bias for the Greek god and goddess, except it is a little difficult to think of two dead immortals, squeaked the gentleman of the eyeglass in the tone of one who scores a point. Mr. Burley was about to reply, and to judge from his ruffled expression his reply would have been of a disciplinary nature. But instead he exclaimed sharply and turned round to face two newcomers. The whole party had become aware of them at the same moment. Two stark Apollos stood over the ruin and were regarding our earthlings with an astonishment at least as great as that they created. One spoke, and Mr. Barnstaple was astonished beyond measure to find understandable words reverberating in his mind. "Red gods!" cried the utopian. "What things are you, and how did you get into this world?" "English!" It would have been far less astounding if they had spoken Greek, but that they should speak any known language was a matter of incredulous amazement. Mr. Cecil Burley was the least disconcerted of the party. "Now," he said, "we may hope to learn something definite, face to face with rational and articulate creatures." He cleared his throat, grasped the lapels of his long dust-coat with two long, nervous hands, and assumed the duties of spokesman. "We are quite unable, gentlemen, to account for our presence here," he said. "We are as puzzled as you are. We have discovered ourselves suddenly in your world instead of our own." "You come from another world?" "Exactly. A quite different world in which we have all our natural and proper places. We were traveling in that world of ours in certain vehicles when suddenly we discovered ourselves here. Intruders, I admit, but I can assure you innocent and unpremeditated intruders." "You do not know how it is that Arden and Greenlake have failed in their experiment, and how it is that they are dead?" "If Arden and Greenlake are the names of these two beautiful young people here, we know nothing about them, except that we found them lying as you see them when we came from the road hither to find out, or, in fact, to inquire." He cleared his throat and left his sentence with a floating end. The utopian, if we may for convenience call him that, who had first spoken, looked now at his companion and seemed to question him mutely. Then he turned to the earthlings again. He spoke again. Those clear tones rang, not, so it seemed to Mr. Barnstaple, in his ears, but within his head. "It will be well if you and your friends do not trample this wreckage. It will be well if you all return to the road. Come with me. My brother here will put an end to this burning and do what needs to be done to our brother and sister. And afterwards this place will be examined by those who understand the work that was going on here." "We must throw ourselves entirely upon your hospitality," said Mr. Burley. "We are entirely at your disposal. This encounter, let me repeat, was not of our seeking."
"Though we should certainly have sought it if we had known of its possibility," said Mr. Catskill, addressing the world at large and glancing at Mr. Barnstaple as if for confirmation. "We find this world of yours most attractive."
"At the first encounter," the gentleman with the eyeglass endorsed, "a most attractive world." As they returned through the thick-growing flowers to the road, in the wake of the utopian and Mr. Burley, Mr. Barnstaple found Lady Stella rustling up beside him. Her words, in this setting of pure wonder, filled him with amazement at their serene and invincible ordinariness. "Haven't we met before somewhere, at lunch or something, Mr. Was all this no more than a show? He stared at her blankly for a moment before supplying her with Barnstaple. "Mr. Barnstaple?" His mind came into line with hers. "I've never had the pleasure, Lady Stella, though of course I know you. I know you very well from your photographs in the weekly illustrated papers. Did you hear what it was that Mr. Cecil was saying just now, about this being utopia? He said we might call it utopia. So like Mr. Cecil. But is it utopia? Really utopia? I've always longed so to be in utopia," the lady went on without waiting for Mr. Barnstaple's reply to her question. "What splendid young men these two utopians appear to be! They must, I am sure, belong to its aristocracy, in spite of their informal costume, or even because of it." Mr. Barnstaple had a happy thought. "I have also recognized Mr. Burley and Mr. Rupert Catskill, Lady Stella, but I should be so glad if you would tell me who the young gentleman with the eyeglass is, and the clerical gentleman. They are close behind us." Lady Stella imparted her information in a charmingly confidential undertone. "The eyeglass," she murmured, "is, I am going to spell it, Fredddymush. Taste, good taste. He is awfully clever at finding out young poets and all that sort of literary thing, and he's Rupert's secretary. If there is a literary academy, they say he's certain to be in it. He's dreadfully critical and sarcastic. We were going to Taplow for a perfectly intellectual week-end, quite like the old times, so soon as the Windsor people had gone again, that is. Mr. Gosse was becoming, and Max Beerbohm, and everyone like that. But nowadays something always happens, always. The unexpected, almost excessively. The clerical caller." She glanced back to judge whether she was within earshot of the gentleman under discussion. "Is Father Emerton, who is so dreadfully outspoken about the sins of society and all that sort of thing. It's odd, but out of the pulpit he's inclined to be shy and quiet and a little awkward with the forks and spoons. Paradoxical, isn't it?" "Of course," cried Mr. Barnstaple. "I remember him now. I knew his face, but I couldn't place it. Thank you so much, Lady Stella." There was something very reassuring to Mr. Barnstaple in the company of these famous and conspicuous people, and particularly in the company of Lady Stella. She was indeed heartening. She brought so much of the dear old world with her, and she was so manifestly prepared to subjugate this new world to its standards at the earliest possible opportunity. She fended off much of the wonder and beauty that had threatened to submerge Mr. Barnstaple altogether. Meeting her and her company was in itself, for a man in his position, a minor but considerable adventure that helped to bridge the gulf of astonishment between the humdrum of his normal experiences and this all too bracing utopian air. It solidified it, if one may use the word in such a connection. It degraded the luminous splendor about him towards complete credibility, that it should also be seen and commented on by her and by Mr. Burley, and viewed through the appraising monocle of Mr. Freddie Mush. It brought it within range of the things that get into the newspapers. Mr. Barnstaple, alone in Utopia, might have been so completely overawed as to have been mentally overthrown. This easy-mannered, brown-skinned divinity, who was now exchanging questions with Mr. Burley, was made mentally accessible by the great man's intervention. Yet it was with something very like a catching of the breath that Mr. Barnstable's attention reverted from the limousine people to this noble-seeming world into which he and they had fallen. What sort of beings, really, were these men and women of a world where ill-bred weeds, it seemed, had ceased to thrust and fight amidst the flowers, and where leopards void of feline malice looked out with friendly eyes upon the passer-by? It was astounding that the first two inhabitants they had found in this world of subjugated nature should be lying dead, victims, it would seem, of some hazardous experiment. It was still more astonishing that this other pair, who called themselves the brothers of the dead man and woman, should betray so little grief or dismay at the tragedy. There had been no emotional scene at all, Mr. Barnstaple realized, no consternation or weeping. They were evidently much more puzzled and interested than either horrified or distressed. The utopian who had remained in the ruin had carried out the body of the girl to lay it beside her companions, and he had now, Mr. Barnstaple saw, returned to a close scrutiny of the wreckage of the experiment. But now more of these people were coming upon the scene. They had aeroplanes in this world, for two small ones, noiseless and swift in their flight as swallows, had landed in the fields nearby. A man had come up along the road on a machine like a small two-wheeled two-seater with its wheels in series, bicycle fashion. Lighter and neater it was than any earthly automobile and mysteriously able to stand up on its two wheels while standing still. A burst of laughter from down the road called Mr. Barnstable's attention to a group of these utopians who had apparently found something exquisitely ridiculous in the engine of the limousine. Most of these people were as scantily clothed and as beautifully built as the two dead experimentalists. But one or two were wearing big hats of straw, and one, who seemed to be an older woman of 30 or more, wore a robe of white bordered by an intense red line. She was speaking now to Mr. Burley. Although she was a score of yards away, her speech presented itself into Mr. Barnstable's mind with great distinctness. "We do not even know as yet what connection your coming into this world may have with the explosion that has just happened here, or whether, indeed, it has any connection. We want to inquire into both these things. It will be reasonable, we think, to take you and all the possessions you have brought with you to a convenient place for a conference not very far from here. We are arranging for machines to take you thither. There perhaps you will eat. I do not know when you are accustomed to eat."
"Refreshment," said Mr. Burley, rather catching at the idea. "Some refreshment would certainly be acceptable before very long. In fact, had we not fallen so sharply out of our own world into yours, by this time we should have been lunching in the best of company."
"Wonder and lunch," thought Mr. Barnstable. "Man is a creature who must eat by necessity whether he wonder or no." Mr. Barnstable perceived indeed that he was already hungry, and that the air he was breathing was a keen and appetizing air. The utopian seemed struck by a novel idea. "Do you eat several times a day? What sort of things do you eat?"
"Oh, surely they're not vegetarians?"
cried Mr. Mush sharply in a protesting parenthesis, dropping his eyeglass from its socket. They were all hungry. It showed upon their faces.
"We are all accustomed to eat several times a day," said Mr. Burley. "Perhaps it would be well if I were to give you a brief resume of our dietary. There may be differences. We begin, as a rule, with a simple cup of tea and the thinnest slice of bread and butter brought to the bedside. Then comes breakfast."
He proceeded to a masterly summary of his gastronomic day, giving clearly and attractively the particulars of an English breakfast: eggs to be boiled 4½ minutes, neither more nor less; lunch with any light wine; tea, rather a social rally than a serious meal; dinner, in some detail; the occasional resort to supper. It was one of those clear statements which would have rejoiced the House of Commons, light, even gay, and yet with a trace of earnestness. The utopian woman regarded him with deepening interest as he proceeded. "Do you all eat in this fashion?" she asked. Mr. Burley ran his eye over his party.
"I cannot answer for Mr.
Barnstable. Yes, I eat in much the same fashion." For some reason the utopian woman smiled at him. She had very pretty brown eyes, and though he liked her to smile, he wished that she had not smiled in the way she did. "And you sleep?" she asked.
"From 6 to 10 hours, according to circumstances," said Mr. Burley.
"And you make love?" The question perplexed and to a certain extent shocked our earthlings. What exactly did she mean? For some moments no one framed a reply. Mr. Barnstable's mind was filled with a hurrying rush of strange possibilities. Then Mr. Burley, with his fine intelligence and the quick evasiveness of a modern leader of men, stepped into the breach.
"Not habitually, I can assure you," he said. "Not habitually."
The woman with a red-bordered robe seemed to think this over for a swift moment. Then she smiled faintly. "We must take you somewhere where we can talk of all these things," she said. "Manifestly you come from some strange world. Our men of knowledge must get together with you and exchange ideas." At 10:30 that morning Mr. Barnstable had been motoring along the main road through Slough, and now at 1:30 he was soaring through Wonderland with his own world half forgotten. "Marvelous," he repeated. "Marvelous. I knew that I should have a good holiday. But this. He was extraordinarily happy with the bright, unclouded happiness of a perfect dream. Never before had he enjoyed the delights of an explorer in new lands. Never before had he hoped to experience these delights. Only a few weeks before he had written an article for the Liberal, lamenting the end of the age of exploration, an article so thoroughly and aimlessly depressing that it had pleased Mr. Peeve extremely. He recalled that exploit now with but the faintest twinge of remorse. The Earthling party had been distributed among 4 small airplanes, and as Mr. Barnstaple and his companion, Father Amerton, rose in the air, he looked back to see the automobiles and luggage being lifted with astonishing ease into 2 lightly built lorries. Each lorry put out a pair of glittering arms and lifted up its automobile as a nurse might lift up a baby. By contemporary earthly standards of safety, Mr. Barnstaple's aviator flew very low. There were times when he passed between trees rather than over them, and this, even if at first it was a little alarming, permitted a fairly close inspection of the landscape. For the earlier part of the journey, it was garden pasture with grazing creamy cattle and patches of brilliantly colored vegetation of a nature unknown to Mr. Barnstaple. Amidst this cultivation, narrow tracks, which may have been foot or cycle tracks, threaded their way. Here and there ran a road bordered with flowers and shaded by fruit trees. There were few houses and no towns or villages at all. The houses varied very greatly in size, from little isolated buildings, which Mr. Barnstaple thought might be elegant summer houses or little temples, to clusters of roofs and turrets which reminded him of country chateaux or suggested extensive farming or dairying establishments. Here and there people were working in the fields or going to and fro on foot or on machines, but the effect of the whole was of an extremely underpopulated land. It became evident that they were going to cross the range of snowy mountains that had so suddenly blotted the distant view of Windsor Castle from the landscape. As they approached these mountains, broad stretches of gold corn land replaced the green of the pastures, and then the cultivation became more diversified. He noted unmistakable vineyards on sunny slopes, and the number of workers visible and the habitations multiplied. The little squadron of airplanes flew up a broad valley towards a pass, so that Mr. Barnstaple was able to scrutinize the mountain scenery. Came chestnut woods and at last pines. There were cyclopean turbines athwart the mountain turrets and long, low, many-windowed buildings that might serve some industrial purpose. A skillfully graded road with exceedingly bold, light, and beautiful viaducts mounted toward the pass. There were more people, he thought, in the highland country than in the levels below, though still far fewer than he would have seen upon any comparable countryside on earth. 10 minutes of craggy desolation with the snowfield of a great glacier on one side intervened before he descended into the upland valley on the conference place, where presently he alighted. This was a sort of lap in the mountain, terraced by masonry so boldly designed that it seemed a part of the geological substance of the mountain itself. It faced towards a wide artificial lake retained by a stupendous dam from the lower reaches of the valley. At intervals along this dam there were great stone pillars dimly suggestive of seated figures. He glimpsed a wide plain beyond, which reminded him of the valley of the Po, and then, as he ascended the straight line of the dam, came up to hide this further vision. Upon these terraces, and particularly upon the lower ones, were groups and clusters of flower-like buildings, and he distinguished paths and steps and pools of water as if the whole place were a garden. The airplanes made an easy landing on a turfy expanse. Close at hand was a graceful chalet that ran out from the shores of the lake over the water, and afforded mooring to a flotilla of gaily colored boats. It was Father Amerton who had drawn Mr. Barnstaple's attention to the absence of villages. He now remarked that there was no church in sight, and that nowhere had he seen any spires or belfries. But Mr. Barnstaple thought that some of the smaller buildings might be temples or shrines. "Religion may take different forms here," he said. "And how few babies or little children are visible," Father Amerton remarked. "Nowhere have I seen a mother with her child." On the other side of the mountains there was a place like the playing field of a big school. There were children there, and 1 or 2 other people dressed in white. "I saw that, but I was thinking of babes. Compare this with what one would see in Italy. The most beautiful and desirable young women," added the reverend gentleman, "most desirable, and not a sign of maternity." Their aviator, a sun-tanned blonde with very blue eyes, helped them out of his machine, and they stood watching the descent of the other members of their party. Mr. Barnstaple was astonished to note how rapidly he was becoming familiarized with the color and harmony of this new world. The strangest things in the whole spectacle now were the figures and clothing of his associates. Mr. Rupert Catskill in his celebrated grey top hat, Mr. Mush with his preposterous eyeglass, the peculiar long slenderness of Mr. Burley, and the square leather-clad lines of Mr. Burley's chauffeur struck him as being far more incredible than the graceful utopian forms about him. The aviator's interest and amusement enhanced Mr. Barnstable's perception of his companion's oddity. And then came a wave of profound doubt. "I suppose this is really real," he said to Father Emerton. "Really real? What else can it be? I suppose we are not dreaming all this. Are your dreams and my dreams likely to coincide?" "Yes, but there are quite impossible things, absolutely impossible things." "As for instance?" "Well, how is it that these people are speaking to us in English, modern English?" "I never thought of that. It is rather incredible. They don't talk in English to one another." Mr. Barnstable stared in round-eyed amazement at Father Emerton, struck by the first time by a still more incredible fact. "They don't talk to anything to one another," he said, "and we haven't noticed it until this moment."
Book 1, Chapter the 4th. The shadow of Einstein falls across the story, but passes lightly by. 1. Except for that one perplexing fact that all these utopians had apparently a complete command of idiomatic English, Mr. Barnstaple found his vision of this new world developing with a congruity that no dream in his experience had ever possessed. It was so coherent, so orderly, that less and less was it like a strange world at all, and more like an arrival in some foreign but very highly civilized country. Under the direction of the brown-eyed woman in the scarlet-edged robe, the earthlings were established in their quarters near the conference place in the most hospitable and comfortable fashion conceivable. 5 or 6 youths and girls made it their business to initiate the strangers in the little details of utopian domesticity. The separate buildings in which they were lodged had each an agreeable little dressing-room, and the bed, which had sheets of the finest linen and very light puffy coverlet, stood in an open loggia. Too open, Lady Stella thought, but then, as she said, "One feels so safe here." The luggage appeared, and the valises were identified as if they were in some hospitable earthly mansion. But Lady Stella had to turn 2 rather too friendly youths out of her apartment before she could open her dressing-bag and administer a refreshment to her complexion. A few minutes later, some excitement was caused by an outbreak of wild laughter and the sounds of an amiable but hysterical struggle that came from Lady Stella's retreat. The girl who had remained with her had displayed a quite feminine interest in her equipment, and had come upon a particularly charming and diaphanous sleeping-suit. For some obscure reason, this secret daintiness amused the young utopian extremely, and it was with some difficulty that Lady Stella restrained her from putting the garment on and dancing out in it for a public display. "Then you put it on," the girl insisted. "But you don't understand," cried Lady Stella. "It's almost sacred. It's for nobody to see, ever." "But why?" the utopian asked, puzzled beyond measure. Lady Stella found an answer impossible. The light meal that followed was by terrestrial standards an entirely satisfactory one. The anxiety of Mr. Freddie Mush was completely allayed. There were cold chicken and ham and a very pleasant meat pâté. There were also rather coarse-grained but most palatable bread, pure butter, an exquisite salad, fruit, cheese of the Gruyère type, and a light white wine which won for Mr. Burley the tribute that Moselle never did anything better. "You find our food very like your own?" asked the woman in the red-trimmed robe. "Exquisite quality," said Mr. Mush, with his mouth rather full. Food has changed very little in the last 3,000 years. People had found out all the best things to eat long before the last age of confusion. "It's too real to be real," Mr. Barnstaple repeated to himself. "Too real to be real." He looked at his companions, elated, interested, and eating with appreciation. If it wasn't for the absurdity of these utopians speaking English with a clearness that tapped like a hammer inside his head, Mr. Barnstaple would have had no doubt whatever of its reality. No servants waited at the clothless stone table. The woman in the white and scarlet robe and the two aviators shared the meal, and the guests attended to each other's requirements. Mr. Burley's chauffeur was for modestly shrinking to another table until the great statesman reassured him with, "Sit down there, Pink, next to Mr. Mush." Other utopians, with friendly but keenly observant eyes upon the earthlings, came into the great pillared veranda in which the meal had been set, and smiled and stood about or sat down. There were no introductions and few social formalities. "All this is most reassuring," said Mr. Burley. "Most reassuring. I'm bound to say these beat the Chatsworth peaches. Is that cream, my dear Rupert, in the little brown jar in front of you? I guessed as much. If you are sure you can spare it, Rupert. Thank you." 2. Several of the utopians made themselves known by name to the earthlings. All their voices sounded singularly alike to Mr. Barnstaple, and the words were as clear as print. The brown-eyed woman's name was Likeness. A man with a beard who might perhaps, Mr. Barnstaple thought, have been as old as 40, was either Earthrid or Adam or Edom. The name, for all its sharpness of enunciation, had been very difficult to catch. It was as if large print hesitated. Earthrid conveyed that he was an ethnologist and historian, and that he desired to learn all that he possibly could about the ways of our world. He impressed Mr. Barnstaple as having the easy carriage of some earthly financier or great newspaper proprietor, rather than the diffidence natural in our own everyday world to a merely learned man. Another of their hosts, Serpentine, was also, Mr. Barnstaple learnt with surprise, for his bearing too was almost masterful, a scientific man. He called himself something that Mr. Barnstaple could not catch. First, it sounded like atomic mechanician, and then, oddly enough, it sounded like molecular chemist. And then Mr. Barnstaple heard Mr. Burley say to Mr. Mush, "He said physiochemist, didn't he?" "I thought he just called himself a materialist," said Mr. Mush. "I thought he said he weighed things," said Lady Stella. "Their intonation is peculiar," said Mr. Burley. "Sometimes they are almost too loud for comfort, and then there is a kind of gap in the sounds." When the meal was at an end, the whole party removed to another little building that was evidently planned for classes and discussions. It had a semicircular apse round which ran a series of white tablets, which evidently functioned at times as a lecturer's blackboard, since there were black and coloured pencils and cloths for erasure lying on a marble ledge at a convenient height below the tablets. The lecturer could walk from point to point of this semicircle as he talked. Likeness, Earthrid, Serpentine, and the Earthlings seated themselves on a semicircular bench below this lecturer's track, and there was accommodation for about 80 or 100 people upon the seats before them. All these were occupied, and beyond stood a number of graceful groups against a background of rhododendron-like bushes, between which Mr. Barnstaple caught glimpses of grassy vistas leading down to the shining waters of the lake. They were going to talk over this extraordinary eruption into their world. Could anything be more reasonable than to talk it over? Could anything be more fantastically impossible? "Odd that there are no swallows," said Mr. Mush suddenly in Mr. Barnstaple's ear. "I wonder why there are no swallows." Mr. Barnstaple's attention went to the empty sky. "No gnats or flies, perhaps," he suggested. It was odd that he had not missed the swallows before. "Shh!" said Lady Stella. "He's beginning." 3. This incredible conference began. It was opened by the man named Serpentine, and he stood before his audience and seemed to make a speech. His lips moved, his hands assisted his statements, his expressions followed his utterance. and yet Mr. Barnstaple had the most subtle and indefensible doubt whether indeed Serpentine was speaking. There was something odd about the whole thing. Sometimes the thing said sounded with a peculiar resonance in his head. Sometimes it was indistinct and elusive, like an object seen through troubled waters. Sometimes, though Serpentine still moved his fine hands and looked toward his hearers, there were gaps of absolute silence, as if for brief intervals Mr. Barnstaple had gone deaf. Yet it was a discourse. It held together, and it held Mr. Barnstaple's attention. Serpentine had the manner of one who is taking great pains to be as simple as possible with a rather intricate question. He spoke, as it were, in propositions with a pause between each. "It had long been known," he began, "that the possible number of dimensions, like the possible number of anything else that could be enumerated, was unlimited." Yes, Mr. Barnstaple had got that, but it proved too much for Mr. Freddy Mush. "Oh, Lord," he said, "dimensions," and dropped his eyeglass and became despondently inattentive. "For most practical purposes," Serpentine continued, "the particular universe, the particular system of events in which we found ourselves and of which we formed part, could be regarded as occurring in a space of 3 rectilinear dimensions and as undergoing translation, which translation was in fact duration, through a 4th dimension, time. Such a system of events was necessarily a gravitational system." Said Mr. Burley sharply. "Excuse me, I don't see that." So he, at any rate, was following it too. "Any universe that endures must necessarily gravitate," Serpentine repeated, as if he were asserting some self-evident fact. "For the life of me, I can't see that," said Mr. Burley, after a moment's reflection. Serpentine considered him for a moment. "It is so," he said, and went on with his discourse. "Our minds," he continued, "had been evolved in the form of this practical conception of things. They accepted it as true, and it was only by great efforts of sustained analysis that we were able to realize that this universe in which we lived not only extended, but was, as it were, slightly bent and contorted into a number of other long unsuspected spatial dimensions. It extended beyond its 3 chief spatial dimensions into these others, just as a thin sheet of paper, which is practically 2-dimensional, extended not only by virtue of its thickness, but also of its crinkles and curvature into a 3rd dimension." "Am I going deaf?" asked Lady Stella in a stage whisper. "I can't catch a word of all this." "Nor I," said Father Amerton. Mr. Burley made a pacifying gesture towards these unfortunates without taking his eyes off Serpentine's face. Mr. Barnstaple knitted his brows, clasped his knees, knotted his fingers, held on desperately. He must be hearing. Of course he was hearing. Serpentine proceeded to explain that just as it would be possible for any number of practically 2-dimensional universes to lie side by side, like sheets of paper, in a 3-dimensional space, so in the many-dimensional space about which the ill-equipped human mind is still slowly and painfully acquiring knowledge, it is possible for an innumerable quantity of practically 3-dimensional universes to lie, as it were, side by side and to undergo a roughly parallel movement through time. The speculative work of Lowenstone and Cephalus had long since given the soundest basis for the belief that there actually were a very great number of such space and time universes, parallel to one another and resembling each other, nearly but not exactly, much as the leaves of a book might resemble one another. All of them would have duration. All of them would be gravitating systems. Mr. Burley shook his head to show that he still didn't see it. And those lying closest together would most nearly resemble each other. How closely they now had an opportunity of learning. For the daring attempts of those 2 great geniuses, Arden and Greenlake, to use the inaudible thrust of the atom to rotate a portion of the utopian material universe in that dimension, the F dimension, into which it had long been known to extend for perhaps the length of a man's arm. To rotate this fragment of utopian matter, much as a gate is swung on its hinges, had manifestly been altogether successful. The gate had swung back again, bringing with it a breath of close air, a storm of dust, and, to the immense amazement of Utopia, 3 sets of visitors from an unknown world. 3? Whispered Mr. Barnstaple doubtfully. Did he say 3? Serpentine disregarded him. Our brother and sister have been killed by some unexpected release of force, but their experiment has opened a way that now need never be closed again, out of the present spatial limitations of Utopia into a whole vast folio of hitherto unimagined worlds. Close at hand to us, even as Lonestone guessed ages ago, nearer to us, as he put it, than the blood in our hearts. Nearer to us than breathing and closer than hands and feet, Father Amerton misquoted, waking up suddenly. But what is he talking about? I don't catch it. We discover another planet, much the same size as ours, to judge by the scale of its inhabitants, circulating, we may certainly assume, round a sun like that in our skies, a planet bearing life and being slowly subjugated, even as our own is being subjugated, by intelligent life which has evidently evolved under almost exactly parallel conditions to those of our own evolution. This sister universe to ours is, so far as we may judge by appearances, a little retarded in time in relation to our own. Our visitors wear something very like the clothing and display physical characteristics resembling those of our ancestors during the last age of confusion. We are not yet justified in supposing that their history has been strictly parallel to ours. No 2 particles of matter are alike. No 2 vibrations. In all the dimensions of being, in all the universes of God, there has never been and there can never be an exact repetition. That we have come to realize is the only impossible thing. Nevertheless, this world you call Earth is manifestly very near and like to this universe of ours. We are eager to learn from you Earthlings, to check our history, which is still very imperfectly known, by your experiences, to show you what we know, to make out what may be possible and desirable in intercourse and help between the people of your planet and ours. We, here, are the merest beginners in knowledge. We have learnt as yet scarcely anything more than the immensity of the things that we have yet to learn and do. In a million kindred things our 2 worlds may perhaps teach each other and help each other. Possibly there are streaks of heredity in your planet that have failed to develop, or that have died out in ours. Possibly there are elements or minerals in one world that are rare or wanting in the other. The structure of your atoms, our worlds may intermarry, to their common invigoration. He passed into the inaudible just when Mr. Barnstaple was most moved and most eager to follow what he was saying. Yet a deaf man would have judged he was still speaking. Mr. Barnstaple met the eye of Mr. Rupert Catskill, as distressed and puzzled as his own. Father Amerton's face was buried in his hands. Lady Stella and Mr. Mush were whispering softly together. They had long since given up any pretense of listening. Such, said Serpentine, abruptly becoming audible again, is our first rough interpretation of your apparition in our world, and of the possibilities of our interaction. I have put our ideas before you as plainly as I can. I would suggest that now one of you tell us simply and plainly what you conceive to be the truth about your world in relation to ours. Book 1, Chapter the 5th. The Governance and History of Utopia. 1. Came a pause. The Earthlings looked at one another, and their gaze seemed to converge upon Mr. Cecil Burleigh. That statesman feigned to be unaware of the general expectation. "Rupert," he said, "won't you—" "I reserve my comments," said Mr. Catskill. "Father Amerton, You are accustomed to treat of other worlds. Not in your presence, Mr. Cecil, no. But what am I to tell them? What you think of it, said Mr. Barnstaple. Exactly, said Mr. Catskill. Tell them what you think of it. No one else appeared to be worthy of consideration. Mr. Burley rose slowly and walked thoughtfully to the center of the semicircle. He grasped his coat lapels and remained for some moments with face downcast, as if considering what he was about to say. Mr. Serpentine, he began at last, raising a candid countenance and regarding the blue sky above the distant lake through his glasses. Ladies and gentlemen, he was about to make a speech, as though he was at a Primrose League garden party, or Geneva. It was preposterous, and yet what else was there to be done? I must confess, sir, that although I am by no means a novice at public speaking, I find myself on this occasion somewhat at a loss. Your admirable discourse, sir, simple, direct, lucid, compact, and rising at times to passages of unaffected eloquence, has set me a pattern I would fain follow, and before which, in all modesty, I quail. You ask me to tell you as plainly and clearly as possible the outlined facts as we conceive them about this kindred world, out of which with so little premeditation we have come to you. So far as my poor powers of understanding or discussing such recondite matters go, I do not think I can better or indeed supplement in any way your marvelous exposition of the mathematical aspects of the case. What you have told us embodies the latest, finest thoughts of terrestrial science, and goes, indeed, far beyond our current ideas. On certain matters, in, for example, the relationship of time and gravitation, I feel bound to admit that I do not go with you. But that is rather a failure to understand your position than any positive dissent. Upon the broader aspects of the case, there need be no difficulties between us. We accept your main proposition unreservedly, namely, that we conceive ourselves to be living in a parallel universe to yours, on a planet the very brother of your own, indeed, quite amazingly like yours, having regard to all the possible contrasts we might have found here. We are attracted by and strongly disposed to accept your view that our system is, in all probability, a little less seasoned and mellowed by the touch of time than yours, short perhaps by some hundreds or some thousands of years of your experiences. Assuming this, it is inevitable, sir, that a certain humility should mingle in our attitude towards you. As your juniors, it becomes us not to instruct but to learn. It is for us to ask, what have you done? To what have you reached? Rather than to display to you with an artless arrogance all that still remains for us to learn and do. No, said Mr. Barnstaple to himself, but half audible. This is a dream. If it were anyone else— He rubbed his knuckles into his eyes and opened them again, and there he was still, sitting next to Mr. Mush in the midst of these Olympian divinities. And Mr. Burley, that polished sceptic, who never believed, was never astonished, was leaning forward on his toes and speaking with the assurance of a man who has made 10,000 speeches. He could not have been more sure of himself and his audience in the Guildhall Hall in London. And they were understanding him, which was absurd. There was nothing to do but to fall in with this stupendous absurdity, and sit and listen. Sometimes Mr. Barnstaple's mind wandered altogether from what Mr. Burley was saying. Then it returned and hung desperately to his discourse. In his halting, parliamentary way, his hands trifling with his glasses or clinging to the lapels of his coat, Mr. Burley was giving Utopia a brief account of the world of men, seeking to be elementary and lucid and reasonable, telling them of states and of empires, of wars and the Great War, of economic organization and disorganization, of revolutions and Bolshevism, of the terrible Russian famine that was beginning, of the difficulties of finding honest statesmen and officials, and of the unhelpfulness of newspapers, of all the dark and troubled spectacle of human life. Serpentine had used the term, the last age of confusion, and Mr. Burley had seized upon the phrase and was making much of it. It was a great oratorical impromptu. It must have gone on for an hour, and the Utopians listened with keen, attentive faces, now and then nodding their acceptance and recognition of this statement or that. Very like would come tapping into Mr. Barnstaple's brain, with us also, in the age of confusion. At last Mr. Burley, with the steady deliberation of an old parliamentary hand, drew to his end. Compliments. He bowed. He had done. Mr. Mush startled everyone by vigorous hand-clapping in which no one else joined. The tension in Mr. Barnstaple's mind had become intolerable. He leapt to his feet. 2. He stood, making those weak, propitiatory gestures that come so naturally to the inexperienced speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "Utopians, Mr. Burley, I crave your pardon for a moment. There is a little matter. Urgent." For a brief interval he was speechless. Then he found attention and encouragement in the eye of Earthred. "Something I don't understand. Something incredible. I mean incompatible. The little rift turns everything into a fantastic phantasmagoria." The intelligence in Earthred's eye was very encouraging. Mr. Barnstaple abandoned any attempt to address the company as a whole, and spoke directly to Earthred. "You live in Utopia, hundreds of thousands of years in advance of us. How is it that you are able to talk contemporary English, to use exactly the same language that we do? I ask you, how is that? It is incredible. It jars. It makes a dream of you. And yet you are not a dream. It makes me feel almost insane." Earthred smiled pleasantly. "We don't speak English," he said. Mr. Barnstaple felt the ground slipping from under his feet. "But I hear you speaking English," he said. "Nevertheless, we do not speak it," said Earthred. He smiled still more broadly. "We don't, for ordinary purposes, speak anything." Mr. Barnstaple, with his brain resigning its functions, maintained his pose of deferential attention. "Ages ago," Earthred continued, "we certainly used to speak languages. We made sounds, and we heard sounds. People used to think, and then chose and arranged words and uttered them. The hearer heard, noted, and retranslated the sounds into ideas. Then, in some manner, which we still do not understand perfectly, people began to get the idea before it was clothed in words and uttered in sounds. They began to hear in their minds as soon as the speaker had arranged his ideas, and before he put them into word symbols even in his own mind. They knew what he was going to say before he said it. This direct transmission presently became common. It was found out that with a little effort most people could get over to each other in this fashion to some extent, and the new mode of communication was developed systematically. That is what we do now habitually in this world. We think directly to each other. We determine to convey the thought, and it is conveyed at once, provided the distance is not too great. We use sounds in this world now only for poetry and pleasure in moments of emotion, or to shout at a distance, or with animals, not for the transmission of ideas from human mind to kindred human mind any more. When I think to you, the thought, so far as it finds corresponding ideas and suitable words in your mind, is reflected in your mind. My thought clothes itself in words in your mind, which words you seem to hear, and naturally enough in your own language and your own habitual phrases. Very probably the members of your party are hearing what I am saying to you, each with his own individual difference of vocabulary and phrasing." Mr. Barnstaple had been punctuating this discourse with sharp, intelligent nods, coming now and then to the verge of interruption. Now he broke out with, "And that is why occasionally as for instance when Mr. Serpentine made his wonderful explanation just now, when you soar into ideas of which we haven't even a shadow in our minds, we just hear nothing at all." "Are there such gaps?" asked Earthred. "Many, I fear, for all of us," said Mr. Burley. "It's like being deaf in spots," said Lady Stella. "Large spots." Father Amerton nodded agreement. "And that is why we cannot be clear whether you are called Earthred or Adam, and why I have found myself confusing Arden and green trees and forest in my mind." "I hope that now you are mentally more at your ease?" said Earthred. "Oh, quite," said Mr. Barnstaple. "Quite. And all things considered, it is really very convenient for us that there should be this method of transmission. For otherwise, I do not see how we could have avoided weeks of linguistic bother. First, principles of our respective grammars, logic, significs, and so forth, boring stuff for the most part, before we could have got to anything like our present understanding." "A very good point indeed," said Mr. Burley, turning round to Mr. Barnstaple in a very friendly way. "A very good point indeed. I should never have noted it if you had not called my attention to it. It is quite extraordinary. I had not noted anything of this difference. I was occupied, I am bound to confess, by my own thoughts. I suppose they were speaking English. Took it for granted." 3. It seemed to Mr. Barnstaple that this wonderful experience was now so complete that there remained nothing more to wonder at except its absolute credibility. He sat in this beautiful little building, looking out upon dreamland flowers and the sunlit lake, amidst this strange mingling of week-end English costumes and this more than Olympian nudity that had already ceased to startle him. He listened and occasionally participated in the long informal conversation that now ensued. It was a discussion that brought to light the most amazing and fundamental differences of moral and social outlook. Yet everything had now assumed a reality that made it altogether natural to suppose that he would presently go home to write about it in the Liberal, and tell his wife, as much as might be advisable at the time, about the manners and costumes of this hitherto undiscovered world. He had not even a sense of intervening distances. Sydenham might have been just round the corner. Presently, two pretty young girls made tea in an equipage among the rhododendra and brought it round to people. Tea. It was what we should call China tea, very delicate, and served in little cups without handles, Chinese fashion, but it was real and very refreshing tea. The earlier curiosities of the earthlings turned upon methods of government. This was perhaps natural in the presence of two statesmen as Mr. Burley and Mr. Catskill. "What form of government do you have?" asked Mr. Burley. "Is it a monarchy, or an autocracy, or a pure democracy? Do you separate the executive and legislative? And is there one central government for all your planet, or are there several governing centers?" It was conveyed to Mr. Burley and his companions with some difficulty that there was no central government in Utopia at all. "But surely," said Mr. Burley, "there is someone or something, some council or bureau or what-not somewhere, with which the final decision rests in case of collective action for the common welfare. Some ultimate seat and organ of sovereignty. It seems to me there must be." No, the Utopians declared, there was no such concentration of authority in their world. In the past there had been, but it had long since diffused back into the general body of the community. Decisions in regard to any particular matter were made by the people who know most about that matter. "But suppose it is a decision that has to be generally observed. A rule affecting the public health, for example. Who would enforce it?" "It would not need to be enforced. Why should it?" "But suppose someone refused to obey your regulation?" "We should inquire why he or she did not conform. There might be some exceptional reason. But failing that, we should make an inquiry into his mental and moral health." "The mind doctor takes the place of the policeman," said Mr. Burley. "I should prefer the policeman," said Mr. Rupert Catskill. "You would, Rupert," said Mr. Burley, as who should say, "Got you that time." "Then do you mean to say," he continued, addressing the Utopians with an expression of great intelligence, "that your affairs are all managed by special bodies or organizations, one scarcely knows what to call them, without any coordination of their activities?" "The activities of our world," said Earthred, "are all coordinated to secure the general freedom. We have a number of intelligences directed to the general psychology of the race and to the interaction of one collective function upon another." "Well, isn't that group of intelligences a governing class?" said Mr. Burley. "Not in the sense that they exercise any arbitrary will," said Earthred. "They deal with general relations, that is all. But they rank no higher, they have no more precedence on that account than a philosopher has over a scientific specialist." "This is a republic indeed," said Mr. Burley. "But how it works, and how it came about, I cannot imagine. Your state is probably a highly socialistic one?" "You still live in a world in which nearly everything except the air, the high roads, the high seas, and the wilderness is privately owned?" "We do," said Mr. Catskill. "Owned and competed for." "We have been through that stage. We found at last that private property in all but very personal things is an intolerable nuisance to mankind. We got rid of it. An artist or a scientific man has complete control of all the material he needs. We all own our own tools and appliances and have rooms and places of our own, but there is no property for trade or speculation. All this militant property, this property of maneuver, has been quite got rid of. But how we got rid of it is a long story. It was not done in a few years. The exaggeration of private property was an entirely natural and necessary stage in the development of human nature. It led at last to monstrous results, but it was only through these monstrous and catastrophic results that men learnt the need and nature of the limitations of private property. Mr. Burley had assumed an attitude which was obviously habitual to him. He sat very low in his chair, with his long legs crossed in front of him and the thumb and fingers of one hand placed with meticulous exactness against those of the other. "I must confess," he said, "that I am most interested in the peculiar form of anarchism which seems to prevail here. Unless I misunderstand you completely, every man attends to his own business as the servant of the state. I take it you have, you must correct me if I am wrong, a great number of people concerned in the production and distribution and preparation of food. They inquire, I assume, into the needs of the world. They satisfy them, and they are a law unto themselves in their way of doing it. They conduct researches, they make experiments. Nobody compels, obliges, restrains, or prevents them." "People talk to them about it," said Earthred with a faint smile. "And again others produce and manufacture and study metals for all mankind, and are also a law unto themselves. Others again see to the habitability of your world, plan and arrange these delightful habitations, say who shall use them and how they shall be used. Others pursue pure science. Others experiment with sensory and imaginative possibilities and are artists. Others again teach." "They are very important," said Likeness. "And they do it in harmony, in due proportion, without either a central legislature or executive. I will admit that all this seems admirable, but impossible. Nothing of the sort has ever been suggested yet in the world from which we come." "Something of the sort was suggested long ago by the Guild Socialists," said Mr. Barnstaple. "Dear me," said Mr. Burley, "I know very little about the Guild Socialists. Who were they? Tell me." Mr. Barnstaple tacitly declined that task. "The idea is quite familiar to our younger people," he said. "Lasky calls it the pluralistic state, as distinguished from the monistic state in which sovereignty is concentrated. Even the Chinese have it. A Pekin professor, Mr. S.C. Chang, has written a pamphlet on what he calls professionalism. I read it only a few weeks ago. He sent it to the office of the Liberal. He points out how undesirable it is and how unnecessary for China to pass through a phase of democratic politics on the Western model. He wants China to go right straight on to a collateral independence of functional classes, mandarins, industrials, agricultural workers, and so forth, much as we seem to find it here. Though that, of course, involves an educational revolution. Decidedly, the germ of what you call anarchism here is also in the air where we come from. "Dear me," said Mr. Burley, looking more intelligent and appreciative than ever. "And is that so? I had no idea." 4. The conversation continued desultory in form, and yet the exchange of ideas was rapid and effective. Quite soon, as it seemed to Mr. Barnstaple, an outline of the history of Utopia from the last age of confusion onward shaped itself in his mind. The more he learnt of that last age of confusion, the more it seemed to resemble the present time on earth. In those days the Utopians had worn abundant clothing and lived in towns quite after the earthly fashion. A fortunate conspiracy of accidents, rather than any set design, had opened for them some centuries of opportunity and expansion. Climatic phases and political chances had smiled upon the race after a long period of recurrent shortage, pestilence, and destructive warfare. For the first time the Utopians had been able to explore the whole planet on which they lived, and these explorations had brought great virgin areas under the axe, the spade, and the plough. There had been an enormous increase in real wealth and in leisure and liberty. Many thousands of people were lifted out of the normal squalor of human life to positions in which they could, if they chose, think and act with unprecedented freedom. A few, a sufficient few, did. A vigorous development of scientific inquiry began, and, trailing after it, a multitude of ingenious inventions produced a great enlargement of practical human power. There had been previous outbreaks of the scientific intelligence in Utopia, but none before had ever occurred in such favorable circumstances or lasted long enough to come to abundant practical fruition. Now, in a couple of brief centuries, the Utopians, who had hitherto crawled about their planet like sluggish ants or travelled parasitically on larger and swifter animals, found themselves able to fly rapidly or speak instantaneously to any other point on the planet. They found themselves, too, in possession of mechanical power on a scale beyond all previous experience, and not simply of mechanical power. Physiological and then psychological science followed in the wake of physics and chemistry, and extraordinary possibilities of control over his own body and over his social life dawned upon the Utopian. But these things came, when at last they did come, so rapidly and confusingly that it was only a small minority of people who realized the possibilities, as distinguished from the concrete achievements of this tremendous expansion of knowledge. The rest took the novel inventions as they came, haphazard, with as little adjustment as possible of their thoughts and ways of living to the new necessities these novelties implied. The first response of the general population of Utopia to the prospect of power, leisure, and freedom thus opened out to it was proliferation. It behaved just as senselessly and mechanically as any other animal or vegetable species would have done. It bred until it had completely swamped the ampler opportunity that had opened before it. It spent the great gifts of science as rapidly as it got them in a mere insensate multiplication of the common life. At one time in the last age of confusion, the population of Utopia had mounted to over 2,000 million. "But what is it now?" asked Mr. Burley. "About 250 million, the Utopians told him. That had been the maximum population that could live a fully developed life upon the surface of Utopia. But now, with increasing resources, the population was being increased." A gasp of horror came from Father Amerton. He had been dreading this realization for some time. It struck at his moral foundations. And you dare to regulate increase. You control it. Your women consent to bear children as they are needed, or refrain. Of course, said Earthred. Why not? I feared as much, said Father Amerton, and leaning forward, he covered his face with his hands, murmuring, I felt this in the atmosphere. The human stud farm, refusing to create souls. The wickedness of it. Oh, my God. Mr. Burley regarded the emotion of the reverend gentleman through his glasses with a slightly shocked expression. He detested catchwords, but Father Amerton stood for very valuable conservative elements in the community. Mr. Burley turned to the utopian again. This is extremely interesting, he said. Even at present, our Earth contrives to carry a population of at least 5 times that amount. But 20 millions or so will starve this winter. You told us a little while ago, in a place called Russia. And only a very small proportion of the rest are leading what even you would call full and spacious lives? Nevertheless, the contrast is very striking, said Mr. Burley. It is terrible, said Father Amerton. The overcrowding of the planet in the last age of confusion was, these utopians insisted, the fundamental evil out of which all the others that afflicted the race arose. An overwhelming flood of newcomers poured into the world and swamped every effort the intelligent minority could make to educate a sufficient proportion of them to meet the demands of the new and still rapidly changing conditions of life. And the intelligent minority was not itself in any position to control the racial destiny. These great masses of population that had been blundered into existence, swayed by damaged and decaying traditions and amenable to the crudest suggestions, were the natural prey and support of every adventurer with a mind blatant enough and a conception of success coarse enough to appeal to them. The economic system, clumsily and convulsively reconstructed to meet the new conditions of mechanical production and distribution, became more and more a cruel and impudent exploitation of the multitudinous congestion of the common man by the predatory and acquisitive few. That all-too-common man was hustled through misery and subjection from his cradle to his grave. He was cajoled and lied to. He was bought, sold, and dominated by an impudent minority, bolder and no doubt more energetic, but in all other respects no more intelligent than himself. It was difficult, Earthred said, for a utopian nowadays to convey the monstrous stupidity, wastefulness, and vulgarity to which these rich and powerful men of the last age of confusion attained. "We will not trouble you," said Mr. Burley. "Unhappily, we know. Only too well do we know." Upon this festering, excessive mass of population, disasters descended at last like wasps upon a heap of rotting fruit. It was its natural, inevitable destiny. A war that affected nearly the whole planet dislocated its flimsy financial system and most of its economic machinery beyond any possibility of repair. Civil wars and clumsily conceived attempts at social revolution continued the disorganization. A series of years of bad weather accentuated the general shortage. The exploiting adventurers, too stupid to realize what had happened, continued to cheat and hoodwink the commonality and burk any rally of honest men, as wasps will continue to eat even after their bodies have been cut away. The effort to make passed out of utopian life, triumphantly superseded by the effort to get. Production dwindled down towards the vanishing point. Accumulated wealth vanished. An overwhelming system of debt, a swarm of creditors, morally incapable of helpful renunciation, crushed out all fresh initiative. The long diastole in utopian affairs, that had begun with the great discoveries, passed into a phase of rapid systole. What plenty and pleasure was still possible in the world was filched all the more greedily by the adventurers of finance and speculative business. Organized science had long since been commercialized, and was applied now chiefly to a hunt for profitable patents and the forestalling of necessary supplies. The neglected lamp of pure science waned, flickered, and seemed likely to go out again altogether, leaving Utopia in the beginning of a new series of dark ages, like those before the age of discovery began. "It is really very like a gloomy diagnosis of our own outlook," said Mr. Burley. "Extraordinarily like. How Dean Inge would have enjoyed all this!" "To an infidel of his stamp, no doubt, it would seem most enjoyable," said Father Amerton a little incoherently. These comments annoyed Mr. Barnstaple, who was urgent to hear more. "And then," he said to Earthred, "what happened?" 5. What happened, Mr. Barnstaple gathered, was a deliberate change in utopian thought. A growing number of people were coming to understand that amidst the powerful and easily released forces that science and organization had brought within reach of man, the old conception of social life in the state as a limited and legalized struggle of men and women to get the better of one another was becoming too dangerous to endure, just as the increased dreadfulness of modern weapons was making the separate sovereignty of nations too dangerous to endure. There had to be new ideas and new conventions of human association if history was not to end in disaster and collapse. All societies were based on the limitation by laws and taboos and treaties of the primordial fierce combativeness of the ancestral man-ape. That ancient spirit of self-assertion had now to undergo new restrictions commensurate with the new powers and dangers of the race. The idea of competition to possess, as the ruling idea of intercourse, was like some ill-controlled furnace, threatening to consume the machine it had formerly driven. The idea of creative service had to replace it. To that idea, the human mind and will had to be turned if social life was to be saved. Propositions that had seemed in former ages to be inspired and exalted idealism began now to be recognized not simply as sober psychological truth, but as practical and urgently necessary truth. In explaining this, Earthred explained himself in a manner that recalled to Mr. Barnstable's mind certain very familiar phrases. He seemed to be saying that whosoever would save his life should lose it, and that whosoever would give his life should thereby gain the whole world. Father Amerton's thoughts, it seemed, were also responding in the same manner, for he suddenly interrupted with, "But what you are saying is a quotation." Earthred admitted that he had a quotation in mind, a passage from the teachings of a man of great poetic power who had lived long ago in the days of spoken words. He would have proceeded, but Father Amerton was too excited to let him do so. "But who was this teacher?" he asked. "Where did he live? How was he born? How did he die?" A picture was flashed upon Mr. Barnstable's consciousness of a solitary-looking, pale-faced figure, beaten and bleeding, surrounded by armored guards, in the midst of a thrusting, jostling, sun-bit crowd which filled a narrow, high-walled street. Behind, some huge, ugly implement was borne along, dipping and swaying with the swing of the multitude. "Did he die upon the cross in this world also?" cried Father Amerton. "Did he die upon the cross?" This prophet in Utopia, they learnt, had died very painfully, but not upon the cross. He had been tortured in some way, but neither the Utopians nor these particular earthlings had sufficient knowledge of the technicalities of torture to get any idea over about that, and then apparently he had been fastened upon a slowly turning wheel and exposed until he died. It was the abominable punishment of a cruel and conquering race, and it had been inflicted upon him because his doctrine of universal service had alarmed the rich and dominant who did not serve. Mr. Barnstable had a momentary vision of a twisted figure upon that wheel of torture in the blazing sun, and, marvelous triumph over death, out of a world that could do such a deed had come this great and peaceful universal beauty about him. But Father Amerton was pressing his questions. "But did you not realize who he was? Did not this world suspect? A great many people thought that this man was a god, but he had been accustomed to call himself merely a son of God or a son of man. Father Amerton stuck to his point. But you worship him now? We follow his teaching because it was wonderful and true, said Earthred. But worship? No. But does nobody worship? There were those who worshipped him? There were those who worshipped him. There were those who quailed before the stern magnificence of his teaching, and yet who had a tormenting sense that he was right in some profound way. So they played a trick upon their own uneasy consciences by treating him as a magical god instead of as a light to their souls. They interwove with his execution ancient traditions of sacrificial kings. Instead of receiving him frankly and clearly and making him a part of their understandings and wills, they pretended to eat him mystically and make him a part of their bodies. They turned his wheel into a miraculous symbol, and they confused it with the equator and the sun and the ecliptic, and indeed with anything else that was round. In cases of ill luck, ill health, or bad weather, it was believed to be very helpful for the believer to describe a circle in the air with the forefinger. And since this teacher's memory was very dear to the ignorant multitude because of his gentleness and charity, it was seized upon by cunning and aggressive types who constituted themselves champions and exponents of the wheel, who grew rich and powerful in its name, led people into great wars for its sake, and used it as a cover and justification for envy, hatred, tyranny, and dark desires. Until, at last, men said that, had that ancient prophet come again to Utopia, his own triumphant wheel would have crushed and destroyed him afresh. Father Amerton seemed inattentive to this communication. He was seeing it from another angle. "But surely," he said, "there is a remnant of believers still, despised perhaps, but a remnant." There was no remnant. The whole world followed that teacher of teachers, but no one worshipped him. On some old treasured buildings the wheel was still to be seen carved, often with the most fantastic decorative elaborations. And in museums and collections there were multitudes of pictures, images, charms, and the like. "I don't understand this," said Father Amerton. "It is too terrible. I am at a loss. I do not understand." 6. A fair and rather slender man with a delicately beautiful face, whose name Mr. Barnstaple was to learn later was Lion, presently took over from Earthred the burden of explaining and answering the questions of the Earthlings. He was one of the educational coordinators in Utopia. He made it clear that the change over in utopian affairs had been no sudden revolution. No new system of laws and customs, no new method of economic cooperation based on the idea of universal service to the common good, had sprung abruptly into being complete and finished. Throughout a long period, before and during the last age of confusion, the foundations of the new state were laid by a growing multitude of inquirers and workers, having no set plan or preconceived method, but brought into unconscious cooperation by a common impulse to service and a common lucidity and veracity of mind. It was only towards the climax of the last age of confusion in Utopia that psychological science began to develop with any vigor, comparable to the vigor of the development of geographical and physical science during the preceding centuries. And the social and economic disorder which was checking experimental science and crippling the organized work of the universities was stimulating inquiry into the processes of human association and making it desperate and fearless. The impression given Mr. Barnstaple was not of one of those violent changes which our world has learnt to call revolutions, but of an increase of light, a dawn of new ideas, in which the things of the old order went on for a time with diminishing vigor, until people began, as a matter of common sense, to do the new things in the place of the old. The beginnings of the new order were in discussions, books, and psychological laboratories. The soil in which it grew was found in schools and colleges. The old order gave small rewards to the schoolmaster, but its dominant types were too busy with the struggle for wealth and power to take much heed of teaching. It was left to any man or woman who would give thought and labor without much hope of tangible rewards to shape the world anew in the minds of the young. And they did so shape it. In a world ruled ostensibly by adventurer politicians, in a world where men came to power through floundering business enterprises and financial cunning, it was presently being taught and understood that extensive private property was socially a nuisance, and that the state could not do its work properly nor education produce its proper results side by side with a class of irresponsible rich people. For by their very nature, they assailed, they corrupted, they undermined every state undertaking. Their flaunting existences distorted and disguised all the values of life. They had to go for the good of the race. "Didn't they fight?" asked Mr. Catskill pugnaciously. They had fought irregularly but fiercely. The fight to delay or arrest the coming of the universal scientific state, the educational state in Utopia, had gone on as a conscious struggle for nearly 5 centuries. The fight against it was the fight of the greedy, passionate, prejudiced, and self-seeking men against the crystallization into concrete realities of this new idea of association for service. It was fought wherever ideas were spread. It was fought with dismissals and threats and boycotts and storms of violence, with lies and false accusations, with prosecutions and imprisonments, with lynching rope, tar and feathers, paraffin, bludgeon and rifle, bomb and gun. But the service of the new idea that had been launched into the world never failed. It seized upon the men and women it needed with a compelling power. Before the scientific state was established in Utopia, more than 1 million martyrs had been killed for it, and those who had suffered lesser wrongs were beyond all reckoning. Point after point was won in education, in social laws, in economic method. No date could be fixed for the change. A time came when Utopia perceived that it was day and that a new order of things had replaced the old. "So it must be," said Mr. Barnstaple, as though Utopia were not already present about him. "So it must be." A question was being answered. Every Utopian child is taught to the full measure of its possibilities, and directed to the work that is indicated by its desires and capacity. It is born well. It is born of perfectly healthy parents. Its mother has chosen to bear it after due thought and preparation. It grows up under perfectly healthy conditions. Its natural impulses to play and learn are gratified by the subtlest educational methods. Hands, eyes, and limbs are given every opportunity of training and growth. It learns to draw, write, express itself, use a great variety of symbols to assist and extend its thought. Kindness and civility become ingrained habits, for all about it are kind and civil. And in particular, the growth of its imagination is watched and encouraged. It learns the wonderful history of its world and its race, how man has struggled and still struggles out of his earlier animal narrowness and egotism towards an empire over being that is still but faintly apprehended through dense veils of ignorance. All its desires are made fine. It learns from poetry, from example, and the love of those about it to lose its solicitude for itself in love. Its sexual passions are turned against its selfishness. Its curiosity flowers into scientific passion. Its combativeness is set to fight disorder. Its inherent pride and ambition are directed towards an honorable share in the common achievement. It goes to the work that attracts it and chooses what it will do. If the individual is indolent, there is no great loss. There is plenty for all in Utopia. But then it will find no lovers, nor will it ever bear children, because no one in Utopia loves those who have neither energy nor distinction. There is much pride of the mate in Utopian love, and there is no idle rich society in Utopia, nor games and shows for the mere looker-on. There is nothing for the mere looker-on. It is a pleasant world indeed for holidays, but not for those who would continuously do nothing. For centuries now, Utopian science has been able to discriminate among births, and nearly every utopian alive would have ranked as an energetic creative spirit in former days. There are few dull and no really defective people in Utopia. The idle strains, the people of lethargic dispositions or weak imaginations, have mostly died out. The melancholic type has taken its dismissal and gone. Spiteful and malignant characters are disappearing. The vast majority of utopians are active, sanguine, inventive, receptive, and good-tempered. "And you have not even a parliament?" asked Mr. Burley, still incredulous. Utopia has no parliament, no politics, no private wealth, no business competition, no police nor prisons, no lunatics, no defectives nor cripples, and it has none of these things because it has schools and teachers who are all that schools and teachers can be. Politics, trade, and competition are the methods of adjustment of a crude society. Such methods of adjustment have been laid aside in Utopia for more than 1,000 years. There is no rule nor government needed by adult Utopians, because all the rule and government they need they have had in childhood and youth. Said Lion, "Our education is our government." Book 1, Chapter the 6th. Some Earthly Criticisms. 1. At times during that memorable afternoon and evening, it seemed to Mr. Barnstaple that he was involved in nothing more remarkable than an extraordinary dialogue about government and history, a dialogue that had in some inexplicable way become spectacular. It was as if all this was happening only in his mind, and then the absolute reality of his adventure would return to him with overwhelming power, and his intellectual interest fade to inattention in the astounding strangeness of his position. In these latter phases, he would find his gaze wandering from face to face of the Utopians who surrounded him, resting for a time on some exquisite detail of the architecture of the building, and then coming back to these divinely graceful forms. Then, incredulously, he would revert to his fellow earthlings. Not one of these Utopian faces but was as candid, earnest, and beautiful as the angelic faces of an Italian painting. One woman was strangely like Michelangelo's Delphic Sibyl. They sat in easy attitudes, men and women together, for the most part concentrated on the discussion, but every now and then Mr. Barnstaple would meet the direct scrutiny of a pair of friendly eyes, or find some Utopian face intent upon the costume of Lady Stella, or the eyeglass of Mr. Mush. Mr. Barnstaple's first impression of the Utopians had been that they were all young people. Now he perceived that many of these faces had a quality of vigorous maturity. None showed any of the distinctive marks of age as this world notes them, but both Earthred and Lion had lines of experience about eyes and lips and brow. The effect of these people upon Mr. Barnstaple mingled stupefaction with familiarity in the strangest way. He had a feeling that he had always known that such a race could exist, and that this knowledge had supplied the implicit standard of 1,000 judgments upon human affairs. And at the same time he was astonished to the pitch of incredulity to find himself in the same world with them. They were at once normal and wonderful in comparison with himself and his companions, who were, on their part, at the same time queer and perfectly matter-of-fact. And, together with a strong desire to become friendly and intimate with these fine and gracious persons, to give himself to them and to associate them with himself by service and reciprocal acts, there was an awe and fear of them that made him shrink from contact with them and quiver at their touch. He desired their personal recognition of himself as a fellow and companion so greatly that his sense of his own ungraciousness and unworthiness overwhelmed him. He wanted to bow down before them. Beneath all the light and loveliness of things about him lurked the intolerable premonition of his ultimate rejection from this new world. So great was the impression made by the Utopians upon Mr. Barnstaple, so entirely did he yield himself up to his joyful acceptance of their grace and physical splendor, that for a time he had no attention left over to note how different from his own were the reactions of several of his earthling companions. The aloofness of the Utopians from the queerness, grotesqueness, and cruelty of normal earthly life made him ready for the most uncritical approval of their institutions and ways of life. It was the behavior of Father Amerton which first awakened him to the fact that it was possible to disapprove of these wonderful people very highly, and to display a very considerable hostility to them. At first, Father Amerton had kept a round-faced, round-eyed wonder above his round collar. He had shown a disposition to give the lead to anyone who chose to take it, and he had said not a word until the naked beauty of dead Greenlake had surprised him into an expression of unclerical appreciation. But during the journey to the lakeside and the meal and the opening arrangements of the conference there was a reaction, and this first naive and deferential astonishment gave place to an attitude of resistance and hostility. It was as if this new world which had begun by being a spectacle had taken on the quality of a proposition which he felt he had either to accept or confute. Perhaps it was that the habit of mind of a public censor was too strong for him, and that he could not feel normal again until he began to condemn. Perhaps he was really shocked and distressed by the virtual nudity of these lovely bodies about him. But he began presently to make queer grunts and coughs, to mutter to himself, and to betray an increasing incapacity to keep still. He broke out first into an interruption when the question of population was raised. For a little while his intelligence prevailed over this emotional stir when the profit of the wheel was discussed, but then his gathering preoccupations resumed their sway. "I must speak out," Mr. Barnstaple heard him mutter. "I must speak out." Now suddenly he began to ask questions. "There are some things I want to have clear," he said. "I want to know what moral state this so-called utopia is in. Excuse me." He got up. He stood with wavering hands, unable for a moment to begin. Then he went to the end of the row of seats and placed himself so that his hands could rest on the back of a seat. He passed his fingers through his hair, and he seemed to be inhaling deeply. An unwonted animation came into his face, which reddened and began to shine. A horrible suspicion crossed the mind of Mr. Barnstaple, that so it was he must stand when he began those weekly sermons of his, those fearless denunciations of almost everything, in the church of St. Barnabas in the West. The suspicion deepened to a still more horrible certainty. "Friends, brothers of this new world, I have certain things to say to you that I cannot delay saying. I want to ask you some soul-searching questions. I want to deal plainly with you about some plain and simple but very fundamental matters. I want to put things to you frankly and as man to man, not being mealy-mouthed about urgent if delicate things. Let me come without parley to what I have to say. I want to ask you if in this so-called state of utopia you still have and respect and honor the most sacred thing in social life. Do you still respect the marriage bond?" He paused, and in the pause the utopian reply came through to Mr. Barnstaple. "In Utopia there are no bonds." But Father Amerton was not asking questions with any desire for answers. He was asking questions pulpit fashion. "I want to know," he was booming out, "if that holy union revealed to our first parents in the Garden of Eden holds good here, if that sanctified, lifelong association of one man and one woman, in good fortune and ill fortune, excluding every other sort of intimacy, is the rule of your lives. I want to know." "But he doesn't want to know," came a utopian intervention. "If that shielded and guarded dual purity—" Mr. Burley raised a long white hand. "Father Amerton," he protested, "please." The hand of Mr. Burley was a potent hand that might still wave towards preferment. Few things under heaven could stop Father Amerton when he was once launched upon one of his soul-storms, but the hand of Mr. Burley was among such things. "Has followed another still more precious gift, and been cast aside here and utterly rejected of men. What is it, Mr. Burley?" "I wish you would not press this matter further just at present, Father Amerton, until we have learnt a little more. Institutions are manifestly very different here. Even the institution of marriage may be different." The preacher's face lowered. "Mr. Burley," he said, "I must. If my suspicions are right, I want to strip this world forthwith of its hectic preference to a sort of health and virtue." "Not much stripping required," said Mr. Bertie's chauffeur in a very audible aside. A certain testiness became evident in Mr. Burley's voice. "Then ask questions," he said. "Ask questions. Don't orate, please. They don't want us to orate." "I've asked my question," said Father Amerton sulkily, with a rhetorical glare at Earthred, and remained standing. The answer came clear and explicit. In Utopia, there was no compulsion for men and women to go about in indissoluble pairs. For most Utopians, that would be inconvenient. Very often, men and women, whose work brought them closely together, were lovers and kept very much together, as Arden and Greenlake had done. But they were not obliged to do that. There had not always been this freedom. In the old crowded days of conflict, and especially among the agricultural workers and employed people of Utopia, men and women who had been lovers were bound together under severe penalties for life. They lived together in a small home, which the woman kept in order for the man. She was his servant, and bore him as many children as possible, while he got food for them. The children were desired because they were soon helpful on the land or as wage-earners. But the necessities that had subjugated women to that sort of pairing had passed away. People paired indeed with their chosen mates, but they did so by an inner necessity and not by any outward compulsion. Father Amerton had listened with ill-concealed impatience. Now he jumped with, "Then I was right, and you have abolished the family?" His finger pointed at Earthred and made it almost a personal accusation. No, Utopia had not abolished the family. It had enlarged and glorified the family until it embraced the whole world. Long ago, that prophet of the wheel, whom Father Amerton seemed to respect, had preached that very enlargement of the ancient narrowness of home. They had told him, while he preached, that his mother and his brethren stood without and claimed his attention. But he would not go to them. He had turned to the crowd that listened to his words, "Behold my mother and my brethren." Father Amerton slapped the seat back in front of him loudly and startlingly. "A quibble!" he cried. "A quibble! Satan too can quote the Scriptures." It was clear to Mr. Barnstaple that Father Amerton was not in complete control of himself. He was frightened by what he was doing, and yet impelled to do it. He was too excited to think clearly or control his voice properly, so that he shouted and boomed in the wildest way. He was letting himself go and trusting to the habits of the pulpit of St. Barnabas to bring him through. "I perceive now how you stand. Only too well do I perceive how you stand. From the outset, I guessed how things were with you. I waited to be perfectly sure, before I bore my testimony. But it speaks for itself. The shamelessness of your costume, the licentious freedom of your manners. Young men and women, smiling, joining hands, near to caressing, when averted eyes, are the least tribute you could pay to modesty. And this vile talk of lovers loving, without bonds or blessings, without rules or restraint. What does it mean? Whither does it lead? Do not imagine, because I am a priest, a man pure and virginal in spite of great temptations, do not imagine that I do not understand. Have I no vision of the secret places of the heart? Do not the wounded sinners, the broken potsherds creep to me with their pitiful confessions? And I will tell you plainly whither you go and how you stand. This so-called freedom of yours is nothing but license. Your so-called utopia, I see plainly, is nothing but a hell of unbridled indulgence." "Unbridled indulgence!" Mr. Burley held up a protesting hand, but Father Amerton's eloquence soared over the obstruction. He beat upon the back of the seat before him. "I will bear my witness," he shouted. "I will bear my witness. I will make no bones about it. I refuse to mince matters, I tell you. You are all living in promiscuity. That is the word for it. In animal promiscuity. In bestial promiscuity." Mr. Burley had sprung to his feet. He was holding up his two hands and motioning the London Boanerges to sit down. "No, no," he cried. "You must stop, Mr. Emerton. Really, you must stop. You are being insulting. You do not understand. Sit down, please. I insist." "Sit down and hold your peace," said a very clear voice, "or you will be taken away." Something made Father Amerton aware of a still figure at his elbow. He met the eyes of a lithe young man who was scrutinizing his build as a portrait painter might scrutinize a new sitter. There was no threat in his bearing. He stood quite still, and yet his appearance threw an extraordinary quality of evanescence about Father Amerton. The great preacher's voice died in his throat. Mr. Burley's bland voice was lifted to avert a conflict. "Mr. Serpentine, sir, I appeal to you and apologize. He is not fully responsible. We others regret the interruption, the incident. I pray you, please do not take him away, whatever taking away may mean. I will answer personally for his good behavior. Do sit down, Mr. Emerton, please, now, or I shall wash my hands of the whole business." Father Amerton hesitated. "My time will come," he said, and looked the young man in the eyes for a moment, and then went back to his seat. Earthridge spoke quietly and clearly. "You earthlings are difficult guests to entertain. This is not all. Manifestly, this man's mind is very unclean. His sexual imagination is evidently inflamed and diseased. He is angry and anxious to insult and wound, and his noises are terrific. Tomorrow he must be examined and dealt with." "How?" said Father Amerton, his round face suddenly grey. "How do you mean, dealt with?" "Please do not talk," said Mr. Burley. "Please do not talk any more. You have done quite enough mischief." For the time the incident seemed at an end, but it had left a queer little tinge of fear in Mr. Barnstaple's heart. These Utopians were very gentle-mannered and gracious people indeed, but just for a moment the hand of power had seemed to hover over the Earthling party. Sunlight and beauty were all about the visitors. Nevertheless, they were strangers, and quite helpless strangers in an unknown world. The Utopian faces were kindly, and their eyes curious, and in a manner friendly, but much more observant than friendly. It was as if they looked across some impassable gulf of difference. And then Mr. Barnstaple, in the midst of his distress, met the brown eyes of likeness, and they were kindlier than the eyes of the other Utopians. She, at least, understood the fear that had come to him, he felt, and she was willing to reassure him and be his friend. Mr. Barnstaple looked at her, feeling for the moment much as a stray dog might do who approaches a doubtfully amiable group and gets a friendly glance and a greeting. 2. Another mind that was also in active resistance to Utopia was that of Mr. Freddie Mush. He had no quarrel indeed with the religion or morals or social organization of Utopia. He had long since learnt that no gentleman of serious aesthetic pretensions betrays any interest whatever in such matters. His perceptions were by hypothesis too fine for them, but presently he made it clear that there had been something very ancient and beautiful called the balance of nature, which the scientific methods of Utopia had destroyed. What this balance of nature of his was, and how it worked on Earth, neither the Utopians nor Mr. Barnstaple were able to understand very clearly. Under cross-examination, Mr. Mush grew pink and restive, and his eyeglass flashed defensively. "I hold by the swallows," he repeated. "If you can't see my point about that, I don't know what else I can say." He began with the fact, and reverted to the fact that there were no swallows to be seen in Utopia, and there were no swallows to be seen in Utopia because there were no gnats nor midges. There had been an enormous deliberation reduction of insect life in Utopia, and that had seriously affected every sort of creature that was directly or indirectly dependent upon insect life. So soon as the new state of affairs was securely established in Utopia, and the educational state working, the attention of the utopian community had been given to the long-cherished idea of a systematic extermination of tiresome and mischievous species. A careful inquiry was made into the harmfulness and the possibility of eliminating the housefly, for example, wasps and hornets, various species of mice and rats, rabbits, stinging nettles. 10,000 species, from disease germ to rhinoceros and hyena, were put upon their trial. Every species found was given an advocate. Of each it was asked, "What good is it? What harm does it do? How can it be extirpated? What else may go with it if it goes? Is it worth while wiping it out of existence? Or can it be mitigated and retained?" And even when the verdict was death final and complete, Utopia set about the business of extermination with great caution. A reserve would be kept, and was in many cases still being kept, in some secure isolation, of every species condemned. Most infectious and contagious fevers had been completely stamped out. Some had gone very easily. Some had only been driven out of human life by proclaiming a war and subjecting the whole population to discipline. Many internal and external parasites of man and animals had also been got rid of completely. And further, there had been a great cleansing of the world from noxious insects, from weeds and vermin and hostile beasts. The mosquito had gone, the housefly, the blowfly, and indeed a great multitude of flies had gone. They had been driven out of life by campaigns involving an immense effort and extending over many generations. It had been infinitely more easy to get rid of such big annoyances as the hyena and the wolf than to abolish these smaller pests. The attack upon the flies had involved the virtual rebuilding of a large proportion of utopian houses, and a minute cleansing of them all throughout the planet. The question of what else would go if a certain species went was one of the most subtle that Utopia had to face. Certain insects, for example, were destructive, and offensive grubs in the opening stage of their lives were evil as caterpillar or pupa, and then became either beautiful in themselves or necessary to the fertilization of some useful or exquisite flowers. Others offensive in themselves were a necessary irreplaceable food to pleasant and desirable creatures. It was not true that swallows had gone from Utopia, but they had become extremely rare. And rare too were a number of little insectivorous birds, the flycatcher, for example, that harlequin of the air. But they had not died out altogether. The extermination of insects had not gone to that length. Sufficient species had remained to make some districts still habitable for these delightful birds. Many otherwise obnoxious plants were a convenient source of chemically complex substances that were still costly or tedious to make synthetically, and so had kept a restricted place in life. Plants and flowers, always simpler and more plastic in the hands of the breeder and hybridizer than animals, had been enormously changed in Utopia. Our earthlings were to find 100 sorts of foliage and of graceful and scented blossoms that were altogether strange to them. Plants, Mr. Barnstaple learnt, had been trained and bred to make new and unprecedented secretions, waxes, gums, essential oils, and the like, of the most desirable quality. There had been much befriending and taming of big animals. The larger carnivora, combed and cleaned, reduced to a milk dietary, emasculated in spirit and altogether be-catted, were pets and ornaments in Utopia. The almost extinct elephant had increased again, and Utopia had saved her giraffes. The brown bear had always been disposed to sweets and vegetarianism, and had greatly improved in intelligence. The dog had given up barking and was comparatively rare. Sporting dogs were not used, nor small pet animals. Horses Mr. Barnstaple did not see, but as he was a very modern urban type, he did not miss them very much, and he did not ask any questions about them while he was actually in Utopia. He never found out whether they had or had not become extinct. As he heard on his first afternoon in that world of this revision and editing, this weeding and cultivation of the kingdoms of nature by mankind, it seemed to him to be the most natural and necessary phase in human history. After all, he said to himself, it was a good invention to say that man was created a gardener. And now man was weeding and cultivating his own strain. The utopians told of eugenic beginnings, of a new and surer decision in the choice of parents, of an increasing certainty in the science of heredity. And as Mr. Barnstaple contrasted the firm, clear beauty of face and limb that every utopian displayed with the carelessly assembled features and bodily disproportions of his earthly associates, he realized that already, with but 3,000 years or so of advantage, these utopians were passing beyond man towards a nobler humanity. They were becoming different in kind. 3. They were different in kind. As the questions and explanations and exchanges of that afternoon went on, it became more and more evident to Mr. Barnstaple that the difference of their bodies was as nothing to the differences of their minds. Innately better to begin with, the minds of these children of light had grown up uninjured by any such tremendous frictions, concealments, ambiguities, and ignorances as crippled the growing mind of an earthling. They were clear and frank and direct. They had never developed that defensive suspicion of the teacher, that resistance to instruction, which is the natural response to teaching that is half aggression. They were beautifully unwary in their communications. The ironies, concealments, insincerities, vanities, and pretensions of earthly conversation seemed unknown to them. Mr. Barnstaple found this mental nakedness of theirs as sweet and refreshing as the mountain air he was breathing. It amazed him that they could be so patient and lucid with being so underbred. Underbred was the word he used in his mind. Himself, he felt, the most underbred of all. He was afraid of these utopians. Snobbish and abject before them, he was like a mannerless earthly lout in a drawing-room, and he was bitterly ashamed of his own abjection. All the other earthlings except Mr. Burley and Lady Stella betrayed the defensive spite of consciously inferior creatures struggling against that consciousness. Like Father Amerton, Mr. Burley's chauffeur was evidently greatly shocked and disturbed by the unclothed condition of the utopians. His feelings expressed themselves by gestures, grimaces, and an occasional sarcastic comment such as, "I don't think," or "What-oh?" These he addressed for the most part to Mr. Barnstaple, for whom, as the owner of a very little old car, he evidently mingled feelings of profound contempt and social fellowship. He would also direct Mr. Barnstaple's attention to anything that he considered remarkable in bearing or gesture, by means of a peculiar stare and grimace combined with raised eyebrows. He had a way of pointing with his mouth and nose that Mr. Barnstaple, under more normal circumstances, might have found entertaining. Lady Stella, who had impressed Mr. Barnstaple at first as a very great lady of the modern type, he was now beginning to feel was on her defence and becoming rather too ladylike. Mr. Burley, however, retained a certain aristocratic sublimity. He had been a great man on earth for all his life, and it was evident that he saw no reason why he should not be accepted as a great man in Utopia. On earth he had done little and had been intelligently receptive with the happiest results. That alert, questioning mind of his, free of all persuasions, convictions, or revolutionary desires, fell with the utmost ease into the pose of a distinguished person inspecting in a sympathetic but entirely non-committal manner the institutions of an alien state. "Tell me," that engaging phrase laced his conversation. The evening was drawing on. The clear utopian sky was glowing with the gold of sunset, and a towering mass of cloud above the lake was fading from pink to a dark purple, when Mr. Rupert Catskill imposed himself upon Mr. Barnstaple's attention. He was fretting in his place. "I have something to say," he said. "I have something to say." Presently he jumped up and walked to the center of the semicircle from which Mr. Burley had spoken earlier in the afternoon. "Mr. Serpentine," he said, "Mr. Burley, there are a few things I should be glad to say, if you can give me this opportunity of saying them." 4. He took off his gray top hat, went back and placed it on his seat, and returned to the center of the apse. He put back his coat tails, rested his hands on his hips, thrust his head forward, regarded his audience for a moment with an expression half cunning, half defiant, muttered something inaudible, and began. His opening was not prepossessing. There was some slight impediment in his speech, the little brother of a lisp, against which his voice beat gutturally. His first few sentences had an effect of being jerked out by unsteady efforts. Then it became evident to Mr. Barnstaple that Mr. Catskill was expressing a very definite point of view. He was offering a reasoned and intelligible view of Utopia. Mr. Barnstaple disagreed with that criticism. Indeed, he disagreed with it violently, but he had to recognize that it expressed an understandable attitude of mind. Mr. Catskill began with a sweeping admission of the beauty and order of Utopia. He praised the glowing health he saw on every cheek, the wealth, tranquility, and comfort of utopian life. They had tamed the forces of nature and subjugated them altogether to one sole end, to the material comfort of the race. "But Arden and Green Lake?" murmured Mr. Barnstaple. Mr. Catskill did not hear or heed the interruption. "The first effect, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Serpentine, I should say, the first effect upon an earthly mind is overwhelming. Is it any wonder," he glanced at Mr. Burley and Mr. Barnstaple, "is it any wonder that admiration has carried some of us off our feet? Is it any wonder that for a time your almost magic beauty has charmed us into forgetting much that is in our own natures, into forgetting deep and mysterious impulses, cravings, necessities, so that we have been ready to say, 'Here at last is Lotus Land. Here let us abide, let us adapt ourselves to this planned and ordered splendor, and live our lives out here and die.' I, too, Mr. Serpentine, succumbed to that magic for a time, but only for a time. Already, sir, I find myself full of questionings." His bright, headlong mind had seized upon the fact that every phase in the weeding and cleansing of Utopia from pests and parasites and diseases had been accompanied by the possibility of collateral limitations and losses. Or perhaps it would be juster to say that that fact had seized upon his mind. He ignored the deliberation and precautions that had accompanied every step in the process of making a world securely healthy and wholesome for human activity. He assumed there had been losses with every gain. He went on to exaggerate these losses and ran on glibly to the inevitable metaphor of throwing away the baby with its bath. Inevitable, that is, for a British parliamentarian. The Utopians, he declared, were living lives of extraordinary ease, safety, and, may I say so, indulgence. "They work," said Mr. Barnstaple, "but with 1,000 annoyances and disagreeables gone, had not something else greater and more precious gone also?" Life on earth was, he admitted, insecure, full of pains and anxieties, full indeed of miseries and distresses and anguish. But also, and indeed by reason of these very things, it had moments of intensity, hopes, joyful surprises, escapes, attainments, such as the ordered life of Utopia could not possibly afford. "You have been getting away from conflicts and distresses. Have you not also been getting away from the living and quivering realities of life?" He launched out upon a eulogy of earthly life. He extolled the vitality of life upon earth, as though there were no signs of vitality in the high splendor about him. He spoke of the thunder of our crowded cities, of the urge of our teeming millions, of the broad tides of commerce and industrial effort and warfare that swayed and came and went in the hives and harbors of our race. He had the knack of the plausible phrase and that imaginative touch which makes for eloquence. Mr. Barnstaple forgot that slight impediment and the thickness of the voice that said these things. Mr. Catskill boldly admitted all the earthly evils and dangers that Mr. Burley had retailed. Everything that Mr. Burley had said was true. All that he had said fell indeed far short of the truth. Famine we knew, and pestilence. We suffered from 1,000 diseases that Utopia had eliminated. We were afflicted by 1,000 afflictions that were known to Utopia now only by ancient tradition. The rats gnaw, and the summer flies persecute and madden. At times life reeks and stinks. I admit it, sir, I admit it. We go down far below your extremest experiences into discomforts and miseries, anxieties and anguish of soul and body, into bitterness, terror, and despair. Yea, but do we not also go higher? I challenge you with that. What can you know in this immense safety of the intensity, the frantic, terror-driven intensity of many of our efforts? What can you know of reprieves and interludes and escapes? Think of our many happinesses beyond your ken. What do you know here of the sweet early days of convalescence, of going for a holiday out of disagreeable surroundings, of taking some great risk to body or fortune and bringing it off, of winning a bet against enormous odds, of coming out of prison? And, sir, it has been said that there are those in our world who have found a fascination even in pain itself. Because our life is dreadfuler, sir, it has, and it must have, moments that are infinitely brighter than yours. It is titanic, sir, where this is merely tidy. And we are inured to it and hardened by it. We are tempered to a finer edge. That is the point to which I am coming. Ask us to give up our earthly disorder, our miseries and distresses, our high death rates and our hideous diseases, and at the first question every man and woman in the world would say, "Yes, willingly, yes." At the first question, sir. Mr. Catskill held his audience for a moment on his extended finger. And then we should begin to take thought. We should ask, as you say your naturalist asked about your flies and such-like offensive small game, we should ask, what goes with it? What is the price? And when we learnt that the price was to surrender that intensity of life, that tormented energy, that pickled and experienced toughness, that rat-like, wolf-like toughness our perpetual struggle engenders, we should hesitate. We should hesitate. In the end, sir, I believe, I hope and believe, indeed I pray and believe, we should say no. We should say no. Mr. Catskill was now in a state of great cerebral exaltation. He was making short thrusting gestures with his clenched fist. His voice rose and fell and boomed. He swayed and turned about, glanced for the approval of his fellow earthlings, flung stray smiles at Mr. Burley. This idea that our poor, wrangling, nerveless, chance-driven world was really a fierce and close-knit system of powerful reactions, in contrast with the evening serenities of a made and finished utopia, had taken complete possession of his mind. Never before, sir, have I realized, as I realize now, the high, the terrible and adventurous destinies of our earthly race. I look upon this golden lotus land of yours, this divine perfected land from which all conflict has been banished. Mr. Barnstaple caught a faint smile on the face of the woman who had reminded him of the Delphic Sibyl. And I admit and admire its order and beauty, as some dusty and resolute pilgrim might pause on his exalted and mysterious quest, and admit and admire the order and beauty of the pleasant gardens of some prosperous Sybarite. And like that pilgrim, I may beg leave, sir, to question the wisdom of your way of living. For I take it, sir, that it is now a proven thing that life and all the energy and beauty of life are begotten by struggle and competition and conflict. We were moulded and wrought in hardship, and so, sir, were you. And yet you dream here that you have eliminated conflict forever. Your economic state, I gather, is some form of socialism. You have abolished competition in all the businesses of peace. Your political state is one universal unity. You have altogether cut out the bracing and ennobling threat and the purging and terrifying experience of war. Everything is ordered and provided for. Everything is secure. Everything is secure, sir, except for one thing. I grieve to trouble your tranquillity, sir, but I must breathe the name of that one forgotten thing, degeneration. What is there here to prevent degeneration? Are you preventing degeneration? What penalties are there any longer for indolence? What rewards for exceptional energy and effort? What is there to keep men industrious? What watchful when there is no personal danger and no personal loss, but only some remote danger or injury to the community? For a time, by a sort of inertia, you may keep going. You may seem to be making a success of things. I admit it. You do seem to be making a success of things. Autumnal glory, sunset splendor, while about you, in universes parallel to yours, parallel races still toil, still suffer, still compete, and eliminate and gather strength and energy. Mr. Catskill flourished his hand at the Utopians in rhetorical triumph. I would not have you think, sir, that these criticisms of your world are offered in a hostile spirit. They are offered in the most amiable and helpful spirit. I am the skeleton, but the most friendly and apologetic skeleton at your feast. I ask my searching and disagreeable question because I must. Is it indeed the wise way that you have chosen? You have sweetness and light and leisure. Granted. But if there is all this multitude of universes, of which you have told us, Mr. Serpentine, so clearly and illuminatingly, and if one may suddenly open into another as ours has done into yours, I would ask you most earnestly, how safe is your sweetness, your light and your leisure? We talk here, separated by we know not how flimsy a partition from innumerable worlds. And at that thought, sir, it seems to me that as I stand here in the great golden calm of this place, I can almost hear the trampling of hungry myriads as fierce and persistent as rats or wolves, the snarling voices of races inured to every pain and cruelty, the threat of terrible heroisms and pitiless aggressions. He brought his discourse to an abrupt end. He smiled faintly. It seemed to Mr. Barnstaple that he triumphed over Utopia. He stood with hands on his hips, and, as if he bent his body by that method, bowed stiffly. "Sir," he said, with that ghost of a lisp of his eye on Mr. Burley, "I have said my say." He turned about and regarded Mr. Barnstaple for a moment with his face screwed up almost to the appearance of a wink. He nodded his head as if he tapped a nail with a hammer, jerked himself into activity, and returned to his proper place. 5. Earthred did not so much answer Mr. Catskill as sit, elbow on knee and chin on hand, thinking audibly about him. "The gnawing vigour of the rat," he mused, "the craving pursuit of the wolf, the mechanical persistence of wasp and fly and disease germ have gone out of our world. That is true. We have obliterated that much of life's devouring forces, and lost nothing worth having. Pain, filth, indignity for ourselves or any creatures, they have gone or they go. But it is not true that competition has gone from our world. Why does he say it has? Everyone here works to his or her utmost, for service and distinction. None may cheat himself out of toil or duty, as men did in the age of confusion, when the mean and acquisitive lived and bred in luxury upon the heedlessness of more generous types. Why does he say we degenerate? He has been told better already. The indolent and inferior do not procreate here. And why should he threaten us with fancies of eruptions from other, fiercer, more barbaric worlds? It is we who can open the doors into such other universes or close them as we choose. Because we know. We can go to them, when we know enough we shall, but they cannot come to us. There is no way but knowledge out of the cages of life. What is the matter with the mind of this man? These earthlings are only in the beginnings of science. They are still for all practical ends in that phase of fear and taboos that come also in the development of utopia before confidence and understanding, out of which phase our own world struggled during the last age of confusion. The minds of these earthlings are full of fears and prohibitions, and though it has dawned upon them that they may possibly control their universe, the thought is too terrible yet for them to face. They avert their minds from it. They still want to go on thinking, as their fathers did before them, that the universe is being managed for them better than they can control it for themselves. Because if that is so, they are free to obey their own violent little individual motives. Leave things to God, they cry, or leave them to competition. Evolution was our blessed word, said Mr. Barnstaple, deeply interested. It is all the same thing, God or evolution or what you will, so long as you mean a power beyond your own which excuses you from your duty. Utopia says, do not leave things at all, take hold. But these earthlings still lack the habit of looking at reality undraped. This man with the white linen fetter round his neck is afraid even to look upon men and women as they are. He is disgustingly excited by the common human body. This man with the glass lens before his left eye struggles to believe that there is a wise old Mother Nature behind the appearances of things, keeping a balance. It was fantastic to hear about this balance of nature. Cannot he with 2 eyes and a lens see better than that? This last man who spoke so impressively thinks that this old beldame Nature is a limitless source of will and energy, if only we submit to her freaks and cruelties and imitate her most savage moods, if only we sufficiently thrust and kill and rob and ravish one another. He too preaches the old fatalism and believes it is the teaching of science. These earthlings do not yet dare see what our Mother Nature is. At the back of their minds is still the desire to abandon themselves to her. They do not see that, except for our eyes and wills, she is purposeless and blind. She is not awful, she is horrible. She takes no heed to our standards, nor to any standards of excellence. She made us by accident. All her children are bastards, undesired. She will cherish or expose them, pet or starve or torment without rhyme or reason. She does not heed, she does not care. She will lift us up to power and intelligence, or debase us to the mean feebleness of the rabbit, or the slimy white filthiness of 1,000 of her parasitic inventions. There must be good in her, because she made all that is good in us. But also there is endless evil. Do not you earthlings see the dirt of her, the cruelty, the insane indignity of much of her work? Phew! Worse than nature red in tooth and claw, murmured Mr. Freddy Mush. These things are plain, mused Earthred, if they dared to see. Half the species of life in our planet also, half and more than half of all the things alive, were ugly or obnoxious, inane, miserable, wretched, with elaborate diseases, helplessly ill-adjusted to nature's continually fluctuating conditions, when first we took this old hag, our mother, in hand. We have, after centuries of struggle, suppressed her nastier fancies, and washed her and combed her and taught her to respect and heed the last child of her wantonings, man. With man came Logos, the word and the will into our universe, to watch it and fear it, to learn it and cease to fear it, to know it and comprehend it and master it, so that we of Utopia are no longer the beaten and starved children of nature, but her free and adolescent sons. We have taken over the old lady's estate. Every day we learn a little better how to master this little planet. Every day our thoughts go out more surely to our inheritance, the stars, and the deeps beyond and beneath the stars. "You have reached the stars?" cried Mr. Barnstaple. "Not yet, not even the other planets. But very plainly the time draws near when those great distances will cease to restrain us." He paused. "Many of us will have to go out into the deeps of space, and never return, giving their lives. And into these new spaces countless brave men." Earthred turned towards Mr. Catskill. "We find your frankly expressed thoughts particularly interesting today. You help us to understand the past of our own world. You help us to deal with an urgent problem that we will presently explain to you. There are thoughts and ideas like yours in our ancient literature of 2 or 3 thousand years ago. The same preaching of selfish violence as though it was a virtue. Even then, intelligent men knew better, and you yourself might know better if you were not wilfully set in wrong opinions. But it is plain to see from your manner and bearing that you are very wilful indeed in your opinions. You are not, you must realize, a very beautiful person, and probably you are not very beautiful in your pleasures and proceedings. But you have superabundant energy, and so it is natural for you to turn to the excitements of risk and escape, to think that the best thing in life is the sensation of conflict and winning. Also, in the economic confusion of such a world as yours, there is an intolerable amount of toil that must be done, toil so disagreeable that it makes every one of spirit anxious to thrust away as much of it as possible, and to claim exemption from it on account of nobility, gallantry, or good fortune. People in your world no doubt persuade themselves very easily that they are justifiably exempted, and you are under that persuasion. You live in a world of classes. Your badly trained mind has been under no necessity to invent its own excuses. The class into which you were born had all its excuses ready for you. So it is, you take the best of everything without scruple, and you adventure with life, chiefly at the expense of other people, with a mind trained by all its circumstances to resist the idea that there is any possible way of human living that can be steadfast and disciplined, and at the same time vigorous and happy. You have argued against that persuasion all your life, as though it were your personal enemy. It is your personal enemy. It condemns your way of life altogether. It damns you utterly for your adventures. Confronted now with an ordered and achieved beauty of living, you still resist. You resist to escape dismay. You argue that this world of ours is unromantic, wanting in intensity, decadent, feeble. Now, in the matter of physical strength, grip hands with that young man who sits beside you." Mr. Catskill glanced at the extended hand and shook his head knowingly. "You go on talking," he said. "Yet, when I tell you that neither our wills nor our bodies are as feeble as yours, your mind resists obstinately. You will not believe it. If for a moment your mind admits it, afterwards it recoils to the system of persuasions that protect your self-esteem. Only one of you accepts our world at all, and he does so rather because he is weary of yours than willing for ours. So I suppose it has to be. Yours are age of confusion minds, trained to conflict, trained to insecurity and secret self-seeking. In that fashion, nature and your state have taught you to live, and so you must needs live until you die. Such lessons are to be unlearnt only in 10,000 generations, by the slow education of 3,000 years. And we are puzzled by the question, what are we to do with you? We will try our utmost to deal fairly and friendly with you if you will respect our laws and ways. But it will be very difficult, we know, for you. You do not realize yet how difficult your habits and preconceptions will make it for you. Your party so far has behaved very reasonably and properly, in act if not in thought. But we have had another experience of earthling ways today of a much more tragic kind. Your talk of fiercer, barbaric worlds breaking in upon us has had its grotesque parallel in reality today. It is true, there is something fierce and rat-like and dangerous about earthly men. You are not the only earthlings who came into Utopia through this gate that swung open for a moment today. There are others." "Of course," said Mr. Barnstaple. "I should have guessed it. That third lot." "There is yet another of these queer locomotive machines of yours in Utopia." "The grey car," said Mr. Barnstaple to Mr. Burley. "It wasn't 100 yards ahead of you." "Raced us from Hounslow," said Mr. Burley's driver. "Real hot stuff." Mr. Burley turned to Mr. Freddie Mush. "I think you said you recognized someone." "Lord Barralonga, sir, almost to a certainty, and I think Miss Greta Gray." "There were two other men," said Mr. Barnstaple. "They will complicate things," said Mr. Burley. "They do complicate things," said Earthred. "They have killed a man." "A utopian?" "These other people, there are 5 of them, whose names you seem to know, came into Utopia just in front of your 2 vehicles. Instead of stopping as you did when they found themselves on a new, strange road, they seem to have quickened their pace very considerably. They passed some men and women, and they made extraordinary gestures to them and abominable noises produced by an instrument specially designed for that purpose. Further on, they encountered a silver cheetah and charged at it and ran right over it, breaking its back. They do not seem to have paused to see what became of it. A young man named Gold came out into the road to ask them to stop. But their machine is made in the most fantastic way, very complex and very foolish. It is quite unable to stop short suddenly. It is not driven by a single engine that is completely controlled. It is a complicated internal conflict. It has a sort of engine that drives it forward by a complex cogged gear on the axle of the hind wheels, and it has various clumsy stopping contrivances by means of friction at certain points. You can apparently drive the engine at the utmost speed and at the same time jam the wheels to prevent them going round. When this young man stepped forward in front of them, they were quite unable to stop. They may have tried to do so. They say they did. Their machine swerved dangerously and struck him with its side, and killed him? And killed him instantly. His body was horribly injured. But they did not stop even for that. They slowed down and had a hasty consultation, and then, seeing that people were coming, they set their machine in motion again and made off. They seem to have been seized with a panic fear of restraint and punishment. Their motives are very difficult to understand. At any rate, they went on. They rode on and on into our country for some hours. An aeroplane was presently set to follow them, and another to clear the road in front of them. It was very difficult to clear the road, because neither our people nor our animals understand such vehicles as theirs, nor such behavior. In the afternoon they got among mountains and evidently found our roads much too smooth and difficult for their machine. It made extraordinary noises as though it was gritting its teeth, and emitted a blue vapor with an offensive smell. At one corner, where it should have stopped short, it skated about and slid suddenly sideways and rolled over a cliff and fell for perhaps twice the height of a man into a torrent. "And they were killed?" asked Mr. Burley, with, as it seemed to Mr. Barnstaple, a touch of eagerness in his voice. "Not one of them." "Oh," said Mr. Burley. "Then what happened?" "One of them has a broken arm, and another is badly cut about the face. The other 2 men and the woman are uninjured, except for fright and shock. When our people came up to them, the 4 men held their hands above their heads. Apparently, they feared they would be killed at once, and did this as an appeal for mercy." "And what are you doing with them?" "We are bringing them here. It is better, we think, to keep all you earthlings together. At present, we cannot imagine what must be done to you. We want to learn from you, and we want to be friendly with you if it is possible. It has been suggested that you should be returned to your world. In the end, that may be the best thing to do. But at present, we do not know enough to do this certainly. Arden and Greenlake, when they made the attempt to rotate a part of our matter through the F dimension, believed that they would rotate it in empty space in that dimension. The fact that you were there and you were caught into our universe is the most unexpected thing that has happened in Utopia for 1,000 years. End of section 6.